What's going on, everyone? It's Ben from YGO from Zero, back with another Retro Yu-Gi-Oh video, and this is going to be a very special episode here, because it is the new year. 2025 is getting started, and we've got a lot of Retro Yu-Gi-Oh to play in this year. And so for people who want to dive in to a new Retro Yu-Gi-Oh format as maybe their New Year's resolution, it can be tough to know where to get started. And so I figure I would go through every single format that I've covered, except for the sort of like weird hypothetical ones that I was doing near the beginning of my channel. And I would go through, show off a tier list for them, showing off what the sort of like best decks are for if you want to get started in the format, but also ranking them based on, my personal enjoyment factor and which formats I think are sort of the best formats to play. So I've already done a video on why I don't generally do tier lists for these like much smaller retro formats, because I do think that it is very, very hard to do in such a small community. But I do think that people enjoy tier lists, people find them fun, and so I figure as a bit of a New Year treat heading into 2025, I would do it. So this is going to be the 2025 definitive, quote unquote definitive, that is, based on my own personal opinions, tier list of all the formats that I've covered on the channel so far. So before we begin diving into the formats themselves, I want to first explain this little tier list I've got here. This is a tier list that I used a while back to rate all the DM era formats based on how enjoyable they are. At the top of it is Peak Yu-Gi-Oh! This is a format that I think everyone should play at least once, because I do think it sort of either exemplifies a certain aspect of the game, or it's just a blast to play. And these are formats that I think are, with further exploration, will just get better and better and richer. So I think that they're very, very good. A great time is formats that I think can be very enjoyable. I mean, I enjoy playing games in them, even if I wouldn't want to necessarily play them all the time. I do think they're very, very good, and they could potentially see a bit of a following. Enjoyable formats are formats that, I'm okay playing them once in a while. I think that they're fine. I don't hate them. That's basically what that is. That's the bare minimum for a format that I would like pick up and play with someone if they asked. Take the Special Sort of Player is a format that I don't really think will appeal to everyone. I think that there are some people who can enjoy them, but I think overall, it really does take a special sort of player who can vibe with the specific quirks of the format to actually enjoy it. And then unplayable are formats that I think are hot garbage. Like, no one really should be playing this format because it's just really, really bad. Now, I don't really put things in unplayable too often, because I think every format out there has people who can enjoy it one way or another. But, maybe a format or two will reach unplayable on this tier list. Who knows? You'll just have to watch and find out. But we're going to go through in chronological order, starting at the very first format that people actually play, and that is Yugi-Kaiba format in May 2002. This is the first format with a limited list, and it is a pretty fun format at first glance. There are tons of back and forth, games and stuff, and very strategic games, and you've got to really manage your resources well. So upon first playing it, you think that it might actually be Peak Yu-Gi-Oh! And I think people thought that for quite some time. But upon further exploration, I think the format has really sort of taken a dip in popularity. And this happened, I would say, starting in 2023, but 2024 really sort of solidified that this is a format that does take a special sort of player. And I know that may be controversial, because Yugi-Kaiba format is a very popular format still compared to some of the other formats on this list. A lot of people probably played it, tried it out, and enjoyed what they played of it. But hopefully in going through the tier list for Yugi-Kaiba format itself, I can sort of explain why I'm putting it in takes a special sort of player. So here we've got the tier list for Yugi-Kaiba format itself, and this is just going through the different decks in the format and placing them in a tier from tier 0 to trash. Let me just briefly explain what these tiers mean. Tier 0 is a deck that I think would just win every single event, and it's just basically unstoppable. Certain decks may be able to beat it here and there, but if people are playing competitively, a tournament is going to be made up of pretty much entirely this deck. And that's just because it's so powerful, right? There isn't really too much counterplay. There might be some counterplay, but like it's not enough to sort of topple this from the top spot. Tier 1 decks are decks that I think are very good and I think can win tournaments consistently, but I don't think they're going to be winning every single tournament, because there are other decks that are on their same power level. Tier 2 are decks that I think can win a tournament occasionally, but they are sort of a bit trickier to play than the tier 1 decks. They're potentially less powerful than the tier 1 decks. And so, if you're planning on just bringing a deck to win a tournament, that's all you care about, I would say don't bring a tier 2 deck. But if you do enjoy a deck and still want to play competitively, I think tier 2 decks can potentially see success there. Rogue decks are decks that I think can win games, but I don't think can win tournaments. And, maybe one can win one in a blue moon, but like, generally they're going to be winning games for you. And maybe you top with them, but they're not really going to be that good overall. Trash decks are decks that I think struggle to even win a game. And so I sort of set up the tiers this way because I think it's a very sort of easy benchmark to judge these on. But, people have different definitions of these things. So if you see someone else placing things in different tiers, that's their prerogative and they can potentially define it differently. But that's my definitions that I use for this. And the reason why I think that Yugi-Kaiba does take a special sort of player is because right at the top of tier 1, I think the best deck in the format right now is Stall Mill. Now, this may seem weird because at the last Yugi-Kaiba tournament, if you look on Format Library and just go to the top cut of that, you see that Stall Mill did not really have much representation overall. Soul Control, which is the other best deck in the format, was very dominant in that top cut. But that's because no one really plays Stall Mill. Stall Mill is a deck that is very degenerate. Basically, the idea of it is you've got 43 cards in your deck, and you just stall out your opponent. There aren't enough removal cards in the format to actually get over enough 2k walls, and you have enough removal cards to potentially clear your opponent's summon skulls, judgments, etc. To get those out of the way, so that way they can't beat over your 2k walls. And also, you've got Ultimate Offering, which you will draw at some point if you're playing 3 copies of it. And Ultimate Offering lets you set monsters during your opponent's battle phase, so even if they clear your 2k defenders, they're not necessarily going to get in for damage. And the idea is you just wait out, and eventually your opponent will get to low enough deck size where you can card destruction them for game. Or you just don't even use card destruction. You just deck out them naturally. Although I think 1 card destruction at least is generally pretty standard in the list. People don't like the deck. They don't like playing it. They don't like playing against it oftentimes. So a lot of people do not bring it. Also, the most skilled Stall Mill player who consistently did well with the deck no longer plays the format anymore. And so I do think that the deck is underrepresented, but not necessarily underrepresented because it's bad. I think it is very, very good. I think it is still the best deck in the room. Not unbeatable. It's not tier 0, but it is tier 1, I think. And it's kind of like Chaos Turbo in GOAT format, where it is the best deck out there. Decks will have to sort of counter this deck and play around this deck, and it is just sort of a format warping deck here. So that's why I'm putting it at the top of tier 1. And Soul Control, I sort of mentioned this briefly, but Soul Control is a very cool deck. It's basically a deck that uses Soul Exchange to be able to bring out things like Summon Skull or Judgment, to just get a big body on board while also removing an opponent's monster at the same time, which is very, very big in Yugi-Kaiba format where card advantage really matters a lot, and your resources also matters a lot. But I do think, one of the reasons it's the best deck here is because it does beat Stall Mill, potentially. But even then, it doesn't necessarily have an easy go about it, And there are other builds that people are bringing of this deck that people are constantly tinkering with it. You've got an Ultimate Offering Soul Control build, which I do think is the best version of the deck right now. Because Ultimate Offering is just a crack card, probably the best card in Yugi-Kaiba format. Basically, I mean, maybe not the best card in Yugi-Kaiba format. You got Pot of Greed in the format as well. But it is such a versatile card, and just with further exploration, people have really, really, latched onto it as just a crazy powerful card that is a staple in the format. And I do think it benefits Soul Control as well as, Stall Mill and other decks. But, I just think Soul Control is the sort of best deck that's not Stall Mill. It just beats sort of every other deck in the format. Well, not every other deck. There are some counters to it, which I will get to. But, I do think it is the sort of second best deck in the room. And I do think it will see continual tournament success, because it's good and also because not many people are bringing Stall Mill. Next up, we got Exodia. Exodia is trash. I mean, maybe you put it in Rogue, but like the thing is that Exodia is basically worse Stall Mill. It's a stall deck, but Stall Mill has card destruction, which outright kills Exodia, and it's a stall deck that is playing bricks in it. So the thing is that like while Stall Mill, all the monsters you're playing are 2k defenders, Exodia, you're playing some pieces, and if you draw those pieces when you really need to see a 2k defender, you're just losing the game. So I'm going to put in trash. I think in the past I might have been charitable and put in Rogue. I'm just going to put in trash because I think it's just the inferior version of a stall deck in this format. If you want to play it for anime fun times, then you can go for it. But I'd recommend that you play the sort of like hypothetical LOB format, which is just the format based around using the cards of Legend of Blue Eyes and nothing else, because it actually is good there. Or you could play in the next format that I'm going to be covering here, which I'll get to when I get to it. But next up, we get Earth Aggro. I'm going to put Earth Aggro in Rogue. Earth Aggro is a deck basically using equip spells, namely Invigoration, to buff up things like Battle Ox. You occasionally do play field spells in this as well, like Sogen. But I think generally the better version of the deck is the one just playing Invigoration. And, this is sort of distinct from, dark equip aggro, right? Like, yeah, dark aggro, I guess. It's just playing like sort of dark destruction stuff, which I do think is slightly better than Earth aggro, but I think it's still in Rogue. But this is just a deck playing like, Ryukishin powered and stuff like that, and you're playing Sword of Destruction to buff it up by 4K, 4,000, not 4K. But you've also got like La Jin that's getting buffed by this, which can beat over like 2K defenders and stuff, and your opponent's La Jins. So I do think that, the Dark aggro deck is a little bit better than the Earth aggro deck just because you've got better, like, lesser beaters, right? The three main beaters in this format are La Jin, Neo, and Battleox. And, once you go into the 1600s and below, it gets a bit iffy. For Earth aggro, there aren't any 1600 Earth monsters that you're using. You're using 1500 Earth monsters, which doesn't enable you to play Last Will, which, sort of segues into Last Will Turbo, which I do think Last Will Turbo is really bad in stall, so I'm going to put it below these decks because at least these decks can beat over a 2K defender. But that's sort of the advantage of playing Earth aggro over Dark aggro, and I don't think it's enough of an advantage to really make it that much better. So I'm going to put all three of these decks in Rogue, but I'm going to put Dark aggro the top of Rogue so far, Earth aggro below it, and then Last Will Turbo below that, because Last Will Turbo is just a deck where you're trying to take advantage of your opponent's trap holes and things like that, so you can Last Will out things like potentially the Wicked Worm Beast, which can have value against certain matchups. Wicked Worm Beast is also going to go in Rogue. I'm going to put it above Last Will Turbo, but below the two Equip aggro decks, and this is mainly because Wicked Worm Beast did not deal with Stall Mill. Wicked Worm Beast is a deck that's basically trying to take advantage of Soul Control, and the way it does this is by using things like the Wicked Worm Beast, which is just a monster that bounces back to your hand at the end of the turn. But if your opponent doesn't have any monsters on field and you've got a Soul Exchange and a Tribute monster in hand, then you're in a kind of tough spot if you're Soul Control. And so Worm Control can be very good. It is a deck that also takes advantage of Ultimate Offering, which is kind of fun. But I do think it is not really good in this metagame because of Stall Mill's dominance. Next up, we got Dragons. Dragons, I'm going to put it I'll put it in tier 2. And the reason I'm going to put it in tier 2 is because it has top tournaments. Well, actually, no. Based on my definitions, I'm going to put it top of Rogue. Because top tournaments never won a tournament. I don't think it ever really can win a tournament. The one nice thing about Dragons is that it can get over Stall Mill. And if you're playing against Stall Mill, you will have time to draw into your combo. The issue with that is that you're kind of like basing everything on that combo. And if you go for the combo, your opponent activates Waboku, and then they activate Raigeki or Dark Hole in the following turn, then you've just basically lost the game. So I think this is top of Rogue. It has topped in the past somehow. I don't know how, because this deck is playing things like Blue Eyes, Flute of Summoning Dragon, Lord of D, etc. A bunch of bricks that are generally pretty bad. So I'm just kind of shocked that people managed to make it work. I still don't get it. There are, still people tinkering with this deck, trying to play like Curse of Dragons or Komori Dragons or things like that to make it work. I just think if you're playing this deck, go for the big Blue Eyes version, and you're not going to win all too often, but you will win enough to have a fun time with it and live out your anime dreams. Next up, we've got Burn. And Burn, when I first made this tier list, it was down in trash tier because I basically said, oh, it's a worse stall deck than Stall Mill. I actually think with further experimentation, it's risen to tier 2. Burn is a deck that really does counter Stall Mill quite well, because before they can really draw into their things to kill you, you're killing them with your burn cards. All you need to do is do enough chip damage or get them to do enough chip damage to themselves with Ultimate Offering to get them down to a threshold where you can actually kill them with all your burn spells. The issue with Burn is that it does suffer into some other decks in the format, but it's one of those decks that I think, like, you got to read where the format's shifting. If everyone's playing Soul Control, you don't necessarily play this deck, but if everyone's going to be playing Stall Mill, this deck can do well enough to top. I'm not sure if it can win an event. I think it could potentially, depending on the layout, which is why it's tier 2. But I do think that it is a deck that has sort of risen in the rankings as the meta has solidified. So that's kind of cool to see. Next up, we've got Fusion decks. These I'm going to put in trash. I'm going to put them below Exodia. And the reason I'm putting them below Exodia is because Fusion decks are kind of in a bad spot overall. There are a couple different Fusion decks you can play. I think the most popular version of a Fusion deck used to be Metal Dragon Turbo, just a deck that goes into Metal Dragon. The reason why that was popular is because all your Fusion materials for Metal Dragon, which is an 1850 monster, are searchable off of Last Will. You can also use Soul Control elements with Steel Ogre Grotto. So, you can sort of use that as your Gyakuten Megami, which would be in like a Stall Mill deck. and then you can go into Metal Dragon and just beat over your opponent's lodge-ins. However, with Stall Mill, that becomes a lot worse because, they're playing 2K defenders, and, Metal Dragon cannot get over that. So I think the better fusion deck now is Guy the Dragon Champion Turbo. But either way, you're kind of in a bad spot because you're playing a bunch of bricks to go into a Guy the Dragon Champion. So you're basically playing a worse version of Dragons. But like Guy the Dragon Champion is one card, which is a lot easier to remove than something like a full board of Blue Eyes. So I think the thing is just strictly worse than Dragon Turbo, and it's just not really good. It is so tough to pull off. It's never going to win a game outside of, it's never even going to win a game against Stall Mill. It's just while you're drawing into your pieces, your opponent's going to run you down, and you're just going to lose the game. So I'm going to put it in trash tier. Next up, I'm going to put back row control. I'm going to put it in tier 2. I'm going to be generous to it. I feel like not enough people have really played this version of the deck. I call it back row control because that's kind of an old name for the deck, but really this is like, I think the version that people prefer is UO control. This is a deck that sort of was created after I covered the format, and it's a very underexplored deck. It's a very skill intensive deck, so not really too many people have tried it out that much, but basically it's a deck that is sort of similar to Ultimate Offering Soul Control, but you're playing some other things like the cards and D-Spell and stuff. Well, maybe not D-Spell. I think someone else cut that. But you're just trying to play a much more controlling game, and you're trying to, deal with your opponent's back row. You're trying to deal with their monsters. Like, it's a very, very sort of mind-gamey style of deck, and a very, very skill-intensive deck as well. So I'm going to put it in tier 2. I think it's very untested here. I think it could potentially do well in tournaments in the future, even against Stall Mill, because, when you play Reaper the cards and stuff, you have a way to out the Ultimate Offering, like, in the main deck. So I do think that is kind of nice against it, and it can do well against other decks as well. So I think it's kind of cool. I'm going to put it in tier 2. Lastly, for the Rogue, we've got Umi Beatdown. I'm going to put this above the Equip Aggro decks, but below the Dragon Turbo deck. The reason I'm putting it above the Equip Aggro decks is because I think Umi is generally a bit of a better buff than things like Equip cards, because if your monster is removed, you don't lose the Equip card, right? Umi is still on the field. And also, you can do cool things with Umi and Ultimate Offering, where you activate Umi, chain Ultimate Offering to it, and then bring out your Great White, which is the card you're using to be buffed with Umi. Whereas you can't really do that with Equip Aggro, because Equip Aggro needs a monster on field first before you activate the Ultimate Offering. So I do think that Umi Aggro is, pretty cool. I'm going to put it in Rogue because, again, I think it has a really bad Stall Mill matchup. But, it could maybe go above Dragons. The only thing that's putting Dragons above Umi is really that it has a better Stall Mill matchup. So this is going to be my tier list for Yugi-Kaiba format. And, the reason why I take Special Sort of Player is the Stall Mill stuff. But if you can stomach facing that matchup occasionally, then I think the format is really fun. And, people still do enjoy it, despite the Stall Mill aspect of things. But it is definitely a very, underplayed deck there right now. So if people do ever, really get into this format competitively, I think that Stall Mill will be sort of the thing that everyone plays. I think it's sort of the easiest deck to win with as well, which is a bad sign, I think. I think a lot of the times, if there's a deck that's dominant in a format, but it's skill intensive, at least that's a bit better, feels a bit better. But like, and Stall Mill is skill intensive, don't get me wrong. You have to know how to play the deck. And as I mentioned, the best player of the deck no longer plays in these events anymore. So, that's part of why the deck has not been as dominant. But I do think it's an easier deck to play than Soul Control, which may seem weird. I'm not devaluing the skill of Stall Mill, but like, I do think that, you can win more games with Stall Mill, basically not really factoring in as much skill, but just getting good draws than you can with Soul Control. So, I think that it's a slightly easier deck to play. I think that's a bad thing when, like, if someone's trying to get into the format and they're like, okay, what's the best, easiest competitive deck that I can play? Easiest in, like, just an on-ramp to the format. I want to try it out, but I haven't really played the format that much, so I want the simplest deck that I can play. And Stall Mill is kind of that, and that is unfortunate. Also, Stall Mill mirror matches are, well, I mean, I will say some people enjoy them. I happen to enjoy them as well because it's very, very interesting. You have to change your way of thinking when you play the deck in that mirror. But I do think that is not for everyone. It is very, very slow, very, very intensive, and games can go on for like over an hour. So it can be very, very tricky to navigate that. But that's going to do it for the tier list for Yugi-Kaiba. Again, this is like based on my opinions. And generally, I'm trying to shift towards doing it more on my opinions rather than the actual just results of the formats, tournaments as well. Because, in my, sort of tier list discussion video where I went through the problem with tier lists, I mentioned that, these formats are just very, very small communities. And so it's kind of tough to factor out variance with just going based off the results themselves. And, I think Yugi-Kaiba is a perfect little example of that, because as people have stopped really playing Stall Mill, not because not the good, but because they just don't like playing it, I do think that it sort of shifted what the meta looks like, because if you just go based on tournament results, it would be like Soul Control first, then Stall Mill, but I do still think Stall Mill is the best deck in the room, and it serves as a major problem for this format. Next format up is Critter format, the format held in August of 2002. And this is a format introducing some new cards from Metal Raiders, named like Sangam, which is Black Forest, Heavy Storm, etc. And you might think that it's relatively similar to Yugi-Kaiba based on just one pack being introduced in a new limited list. But it actually is very, very different. It adds so much complexity to the game, whether it be through monsters with new powerful effects, or things like Heavy Storm or Mirror Force, changing the way that people set back row and attack in, respectively. And I actually think, based on all its complexity, it is peak Yu-Gi-Oh! That may seem weird, that the second format in the game's history is peak Yu-Gi-Oh! And to be fair, for some people, it might be too slow. It is a very, very grindy format, very control-oriented format. But I do think it sort of is the format that best exemplifies the control aspects of the game. And if you like control decks, this is the format for you. This is a control player's paradise, because there are a lot of decks that play control in this format. And that's not to say there aren't other types of decks as well. There are aggro decks, there are combo decks, there are things like that. Not every deck is on equal footing. Like, I do think certain decks are better than others, but I do think that this format is still really, really fun after a lot of exploration. And there is still a lot to explore here. So, in the future, as people explore it more, maybe it will fall down in the rankings. But I do think it is peak Yu-Gi-Oh! Right now as it is. So let's dive into the decks of current format and just sort of talk about what the metagame looks like. Now, there are a lot of decks listed here in this tier list. That's mainly because I was basically going off of the last Critter tier list I made, which was a long time ago, earlier in the channel's history, and way back when I covered a lot more different decks on the channel, even decks that, are just really, really, really bad. And so, a lot of these decks, they're just going to be in trash here, basically, by default. But, there are still a surprising amount of variety in Critter format. A lot of different decks you can play and do pretty well with. So if you're looking for a deck to sort of start off the format with, the sort of best and easiest deck that you can play, I don't think any deck is really that easy in the format. I think every deck will take a bit of a learning curve just because of getting used to how the format actually plays. But I think the most straightforward deck that you can play is probably Muku Muku Turbo. And, luckily Muku Muku Turbo is sort of the best deck in the format right now. This is a much more contentious claim than something like saying Stall Mill is the best deck in Yugi-Kaiba format, because it is a lot closer. I think there are other decks that really do, counter Muku Muku Turbo and can be very good against Muku Muku Turbo. But I think part of what makes Muku Muku Turbo so good is that it does take a bit less thought than some of the other decks. It doesn't take no thought. It is a very difficult deck to play, because this format's a very difficult format to play, right? There's a lot you have to consider, a lot of like mapping out the coming turns and figuring out what your opponent is doing on coming turns, and figuring out what to play around versus what not to play around, etc. But I do think that Muku Muku Turbo has the most straightforward game plan. Basically, you start by sitting on a big body, namely Muku Muku. And, once your opponent clears Muku Muku, you pivot into other game plans. But, until they have cleared the Muku Muku, you're just basically sitting on it and running them down, And so this deck largely puts the onus on the opponent to be thinking of things to do rather than yourself. Not to say that there isn't anything to think about with this deck, because with every deck in the format, there's a lot to think about. But I do think that this does make Muku Muku a little bit easier than some of the other decks that I think are in Tier 1. Another Tier 1 deck that I got to talk about here is Mask Control. I think this is one of the more iconic decks of the format. This is the deck that everyone was playing a couple years ago when people were really first starting to dive down into the format, basically using Mask Sorcerer to get you draws and just playing a suite of counter traps and things like that as well to back this thing up. And I do think this deck is still very good. I just think it is a very, very difficult deck to play, much more complicated than Muku Muku Turbo. And again, that's not a knock on Muku's complexity. It's just Mask Control is one of the most complicated decks, maybe in the game's history. I'm not sure if I'm willing to make that claim, given some of the decks that have arisen in Modern, but it's complex in a different way than those Modern decks are. With the Modern decks, oftentimes it's complex based on like which combo lines you can do and what you want to play around that way. With Mask Control, it's more complex because of the lack of different actions you can do on a turn, right? You have to commit to certain things on a certain turn. You have to know when to go for certain things versus not going for other things. And I do think that makes this deck very, very difficult to pilot. But when you can pilot it well, this deck is crazy, crazy strong and very, very good in the format. So I'm going to put it in tier 1 right behind the Muka Muka control there. So those are the two decks I wanted to talk about just starting out the tier list discussion. Now I'll just go through the decks in order of how they appear in the images down here. First, we got Stallmill with trash here. I'm just going to say it. Heavy Storm getting rid of Ultimate Offering, and Muka Muka being able to beat over all your opponent's stuff. This deck just can't really compete in this format. And thank goodness for that. I'm very happy to see this thing gone. But I do think it's trash here. I don't think it's like Rogue or above. Even though you could play it if you want to, it's just like in Critter format, decks are so much faster than they were in Yugi-Kaiba format. And also they've got so many more tools to deal with set monsters. So yeah, it's trash here for me. Catapult Turtle OTK I'm going to put in tier 2. This is sort of a combo deck that is, I think, still very underexplored in the format. This is a deck that does use Ultimate Offering, which does suffer from Heavy Storm, but it is a deck that's trying to just basically, eat into the opponent's life points over time and then kill them with a big combo at the end of the game. You can Catapult Turtle, tripping off your Sangans and Witches of the Black Forests, and then bring out like Jiragumo to tribute that and doing stuff like that. It's a very interesting deck, very, very difficult deck to pilot, very difficult deck to build as well. I think this deck is still underexplored in the format, and I'm going to put in tier 2 because it has had some tournament success in the past with like topping events. And I do think in the future, I think if someone figures out how to build this thing, it can win an event. After it wins the event, surprisingly, it actually might drop down to Rogue or something, because I do think a deck like this really needs the element of surprise to work as well as it does. But I do think that because I could see it winning an event in the future, I'm going to put in tier 2 here. Next up, we get Clown Control. I think Clown Control is trash. I'm going to be honest. I know that people do find the deck fun, but like, it just does not have the tools to keep the clowns alive long enough to actually get their effects off. And also with double Sangan and Witch in the format, it can be kind of awkward. Crass Clown, I think, is the better clown in this format potentially, because you do get to bounce back the Sangan and Witch as opposed to popping it like Dream Clown does. So I'm going to put in trash here, but use Crash Clown as the sort of image for it. It's just not a really good deck. It will get better in the next format, which we will get to soon, but in this format, it's just not really that good. Exodia, you might expect Exodia to be in trash here along with Stallmill and stuff, but Exodia actually did get some tools to turn it into a bit of a combo deck. Sangan, which is the Black Forest, searching out your pieces, and Last Will to bring out more Sangans and which is the Black Forest, does enable you to sort of search out a bunch of pieces in one turn. And actually, Exodia won the last tournament, so you might expect me to put it in tier 1. I'm actually going to put it in tier 2, maybe at the top of tier 2. But the reason I put it in tier 2 is because as time has gone on, people have realized that certain outs to Exodia, like Robin Goblin, for instance, are also very good against things like Muka Muka Turbo. So decks like Hand Control, or even if they're not Hand Control completely, decks playing Hand Control tools have become very common in this format, and that really does hurt Exodia. Exodia was one of those decks that won an event because of the element of surprise, but now that people know about it and know that it's in the format, it has become a lot worse. And even in the winning list from the last event, the pilot of that deck said that Exodia never actually came up. It was basically like playing 5 bricks in the deck, and they mainly won on the merits of Muka Muka Turbo. So Exodia, top of tier 2. I can't really put it any higher than this so far. Maybe with a new build, maybe we'll get higher, but right now, I'm going to put it at top of tier 2. Next up, Gate Guardian. I mean, it's just trash. This deck is really, really bad. You got to bring out 3 high tribute monsters, and then you got to bring out a Gate Guardian on top of that. None of those are searchable. It is just so awful. Yeah, basically unplayable in this format. You're just basically playing a bunch of bricks. Great Moth. I think Great Moth might be worse than Gate Guardian. Great Moth is a deck that just plays, Petite Moth and Cocoon of Evolution to level up into a Great Moth, but it takes way too long, and the payoff isn't even that good because your opponent likely has a ton of removal for it in the end of the day. So this thing is not really that good. Harpy Ladies, you might expect it to go in trash as well. I'm going to put it in Rogue. I think Harpy Ladies is a neat sort of deck. It is a deck that sort of uses the Muka Muka Turbo engine because you're just playing a bunch of Muka Mukas to pair with your bricks and stuff, but it can get aggressive in interesting ways that other decks cannot in the format, using Elegant Egotist and things like that. And Harpy Lady Sisters is a decent boss. It doesn't really compare to Muka Muka, which is a bit of a downside for the deck, but it is sort of a decent thing. And just extending with Egotist, it's kind of nice. So I'm going to put it in Rogue. I don't really think it's higher than that, but you can win some games with it here and there. Next up, we've got more of a counter trap heavy deck. Some of the times versions of this deck play like Mask of Darkness. Sometimes they don't, but I'm going to put it in tier 2. I think this deck is kind of interesting. I'm not sure if you'd want to go full counter trap. but compared to just playing some counter traps and something like Mass Control. But if you do want to go full counter trap, I think more innovation has been done in that realm this year. For instance, Jazz won, or not won, but he did very well with a deck playing Horn of Heaven in it. And Horn of Heaven was a card that was sort of viewed as a very bad card for a lot of Critter formats history, because the counter trap that tributes a monster on field to negate a summon, and you might expect that to be pretty bad. But actually, what Jazz realized is that in something like Mass Control, where you're playing like Mass Sorcerers and things, or like you've got Sangin and Witches out, Master Sorcerer is going to die to a Sangin or Witch Summon anyways, so you're not really losing anything too much when you activate Horn of Heaven. You're actually just getting rid of their monster in addition to losing the monster you already would have lost. It also shuts off Sangin and Witch Chains, which is very, very important in this format. So I think that Horn of Heaven is very good, and, as a result, I think that the counter trap heavy deck can also be pretty good here. And you can apply the same sort of logic to like flipping up Mask of Darkness to get back Horn of Heaven. Mask of Darkness, you can distribute that and get rid of the Sangin or Witch, etc. So these counter trap heavy decks can potentially be, something in this format. I don't know if they're better than Mass Control, as I mentioned, but I do think there's something. So I'm going to put it at bottom of tier 2. Next up, we've got just like aggro, like, just playing big bodies, right? Jiroi Gumo and Dark Elf aren't in this format. You just play them, beat down your opponent with them, and just try and get aggressive that way. I think that's a strategy that, like, still needs experimentation. I think that, like, people have focused on the control elements of this format. They haven't really focused on the aggro elements. So I'm going to put it above the Turtle OTK decks, because I do think that this is a deck that can get sort of ironed out more quickly than Turtle OTK, and also it's a lot simpler than Turtle OTK. So I do think it's probably a bit better. Generally, it's kind of like Occam's Razor. Like, the simpler a deck is, and the simpler its game plan is, if that game plan is relatively good, it's generally a bit better than the more complex decks. As long as they're of similar ceilings, right? I think that this deck probably has a similar ceiling to something like Turtle OTK. But I do think that, this could be potentially something that people experiment with in the future. People have seen success with certain aggressive decks in the past, but I do think that the sort of pure aggro deck has not really been experimented with enough. Speaking of aggro decks that have seen success in the past, we get Labyrinth Tank Turbo, and I'm going to put this in. It's a bit tough. I might have to put it in tier 2 because it has won a previous event, and I think that people have not really adapted too much to it. Well, I'll put it in tier 2. I'll put it at bottom of tier 2. The reason for this is that this deck has won an event, and I know that that sounds kind of crazy because, like, Labyrinth Tank, isn't that the janky fusion monster, like, that, at just 2400 attack? Like, why is that deck winning events? Well, the reason it won an event is because everyone was on Solemn Judgment at that point in the format's history, and this deck played triple Cannon Soldier. Cannon Soldier is a busted card. Most decks play one copy of it at least. But this deck kind of showed that if you have 3 copies of it, it can be pretty good. Also, Gigatech Wolf is not the worst material in the world. It does have 1400 defense, which does wall off a lot in this format. So it's not the worst thing ever. But the Labyrinth Tank part of the deck is definitely pretty bad, in my opinion. I think this is just largely a deck showing that 3 Cannon Soldier is very good in a format where everyone's playing Solemn Judgments. And that's sort of what happened there. I think people have sort of cut down on Solemn Judgments since then. Not everyone's playing Mass Control. A lot of people are more playing Muka Muka Turbo, which doesn't really play as many Solemns. So I think this deck is a bit worse than it was back when it won, which is why I'm tempted to put it in Rogue. But I do think that if Mass Control does get better in the future, and I do think that people are trying to iterate on Mass Control more, play it more, and potentially play Solemn more as well, I think this deck could potentially rise up. But again, that's mainly because of the Cannon Soldiers. So realistically, this is just triple Cannon Soldier Turbo. But, like, I figured I'd put it here anyways. I think we get Dragons. Dragons are trash, but they're better than, they're better than probably all the other trash tier decks that I've put in the tier so far. So I'm going to put them in trash. I mean, it's just like, if losing to Waboku was bad enough for your Dragon combo, losing to Mirror Force is even worse. And they're just decks that are doing much better things all the time compared to this one. And also with hand control decks in the format, you're losing your pieces as well. So it's not really the best thing ever. So I'm going to put it in trash tier. Next, we get Flip Control. Flip Control is like, I was much more granular in my coverage of these formats back when I first covered them. So Flip Control is kind of just the deck playing a bunch of flip monsters. I mean, it's sort of like nebulous what defines this versus like Mass Control or things like that. There's a lot of flip monsters in this format. I think the main defining thing is that this deck also plays multiple Man-Eater Bugs. And I think Man-Eater Bug is a lot worse in the main compared to the side. But I don't think this deck's bad. I just think it's like, worse than other decks that are strictly better than it. So I'm going to put it in tier 2. I think you could do well with it, but it's like, why would you play this for something else? So that's sort of where I fall on that. Pumpkin, I'm going to put in trash here. Pumpkin is like probably better than Gate Guardian, but that's not saying much. Pumpkin is just a zombie deck, but zombies are not really that good here. That zombie is Shadow Ghoul, but Shadow Ghoul is basically worse Summon Skull most of the time, unless you get a ton of monsters in your grave. And Pumpkin, if you do want to play Pumpkin itself, it is just a terrible monster. Awful stuff. So I have actually won a game with this deck on the channel, which is kind of funny. But this deck is just really, really bad. I would not recommend playing it in any capacity. Next, we got Hand Control. Hand Control is definitely tier 2. Actually, this probably goes above Exodia here. You could even put this in tier 1, I think. But, like, I do think that Hand Control as a strategy in itself is a bit worse than Mass Control. It does counter Muka Muka, though. I think that maybe Hand Control goes into tier 1 for now. The thing is that, like, with a lot of these decks, it can be tough to rank because a lot of the other decks sort of take aspects from them and sort of use them to bolster their own strategies. So, like, for instance, a lot of Muka Muka Turbo decks now are playing Rob and Goblin in the main. Because if you've got a big Muka Muka, you know, then you can easily just deal that damage very quickly and rip your opponent's hand apart. And it's very good against other Muka Muka Turbo decks. And so, like, this Rob and Goblin, I think, is what makes the hand control deck. I don't really like White Magical Hat as much. And Card Destruction is really bad, I think. So, you know, does this belong in tier 2 or should it be in tier 1? You know, it's tough to say. I'm going to put it in tier 1 because I do think you can probably win if you just go all in on hand control and run your opponent down with that. So maybe it could do well in the future. So I'll put it there, but this realistically is probably in tier 2 because people haven't really done much with it. But I think right now the meta is in a good place for a deck that's ripping apart your opponent's hand, so I'm going to put it in tier 1. Next up we got Soul Control. Soul Control, I mean, this is just trash. It's trash here. Probably, now, I'm going to put it below Dragons. The reason why Soul Control is trash in this format where it was so good in the last format is because Sangan and Witch are really, really bad to Soul Exchange over. And oftentimes, if your opponent's setting a thing, it oftentimes is Sangan and Witch. So this thing is not good, in my opinion. Next up, we've got Burn. I want to put Burn in tier 2 or Rogue. I'm going to put it with the sort of like just aggro deck. I think they're very similar. I think, honestly, the aggro deck playing Dragumo Dark Elves, the aggro Burn deck with, like, you know, Tremendous Fire and other cards like that, and the Turtle OTK deck are all sort of in a similar realm. So I'm going to put them kind of grouped together in tier 2. Like, they're all decks trying to play around a certain concept, which is just running down your opponent as quickly as possible with burn cards or with just big guys. And so I do think that they're kind of like one sort of deck concept. So I'm going to put them all in tier 2. I think they can do well in the future. Next up, we've got, you know, sort of Twin-Headed Thunder Dragon. I mean, Twin-Headed Thunder Dragon. I'm gonna shift some things around. I think, honestly, some of these things at the end of tier 2 can probably go in Rogue. I'm going to put Flip Control. I really just want to remove Flip Control from the video entirely, but I'm actually going to just put it in Rogue, because if you're just playing Mana Bugs to play them, be like, that's not really that good, right? So, yeah, I think I'm just going to set it up like this. I think that's fine. It balances things out a bit more. I do think that, like frankly, the Fusion decks are probably Rogue. Like, Twin of Thunder Dragon, I think it's better than Labyrinth Tank Turbo, because it is just a Muka Muka Turbo deck with, like, polymerization, because you already played Thunder Dragon in Muka Muka Turbo, so it just gives you another extender at the end of the game to do things with. So I do like this a little bit better than Labyrinth Tank Turbo, even though Labyrinth Tank Turbo is just better into certain metagames. But I do think that Twin Thunder Dragon Turbo is, like, just strictly worse Muka Muka. Kind of like how Flip Control is just strictly worse Mass Control. And I do think that these decks, like, they're probably not going to win an event anytime soon, even though they can see some success in topping and winning games. But yeah, I think that's going to do it for the tier list. As you can see, there's a lot of decks here now. A lot of these decks could just be cut out. Like, the entire trash tier is mainly here just because they exist, and because I was much more granular in coverage back when I first covered this format. I wanted to preserve the tier list as was. But yeah, I think this is a pretty good tier list for the format right now, and this could really, really change in the future. This is just as it is at the beginning of 2025. This is my opinions on it. And I'm excited to see how it does change in the future, because I think there's a lot of potential for shakeup here. And it's just really, really fun to see a metagame this diverse in such an early format in the game's history. Next up, we got Treasure format, the format held in October of 2002. And this format can be a little bit controversial for some people, because some people like morphing jar in the format based on, you know, when releases came out, because there were a lot of things released basically at the same time. Like October 1st, 2002 was when the ban list dropped, or limited list, I guess, and also when Torn Pack 2 released. So some people like including Torn Pack 2 in the format, some people don't. I generally go with not, because I figure, you know, if the limited list came out at that time, there had to be an event for it to then win the Tournament Pack. So, like, realistically, like, there would have been an event without Tournament Pack 2 cards in them. So that's why I sort of like exclude Morphing Jar from the format. But if Morphing Jar is in the format becomes a lot worse, because Morphing Jar makes Empty Jar so good. And without Morphing Jar, I think the format is still pretty good. I'm going to give it, enjoyable or great time. I don't think it's peak Yu-Gi-Oh! Because the hand rips are in the format now, and people do not like the hand rips. But I also don't think the hand rips are as bad as a lot of people think they will be in a format this early in the game's history, because they do serve an important purpose. They disrupt the sort of like Sangan Witch resource loop, where like if your opponent searches out a monster with Sangan or Witch, you can actually use a hand rip to get rid of that and cut that resource loop off. So that's pretty good. I'm gonna put it. Yeah, I'm gonna put it in a great time. I like Treasure a lot. I think it's really fun. And I do think that like while it is not as good as Critter, I think that it is a format that feels similar to Critter, but you can play a lot of different like rogue strategies to relatively good success in the format. I think like there were new tools added for it. And so I do think it's a pretty fun time. So I recommend people try it out. I'd say if you're trying a format from this time, try Critter first. Critter's the sort of like peak of the era. But if you like Critter and you want to sort of dip your toes into other things, or if you find Critter a bit too slow, you might like Treasure format or the next format as well. But before we cover the next format, we got to do a tier list for Treasure now. Now, I think Treasure is actually the first format in the game's history where you start to actually have enough good cards that you can just play in a deck that, like, good stuff just becomes a deck you can play, right? Like Cookie Cutter, whatever you want to call it. I think that sort of deck that just playing good cards and just going with a standard, win the game through depleting your opponent's life points to 0 by attacking him with things and just activating powerful effects. I think that strategy is now viable, and it's very good. So it does go in tier 1. There are different ways to build this deck, but I do think the deck is extremely strong, and it belongs at the top of the format as the best deck in the format. But I don't think we've reached the point where it's tier 0. I don't think it belongs there, and the reason for that is I think Burn is actually a very good counter to that strategy in this format. Not necessarily because it counters that strategy exactly, but just because it's a very powerful deck in its own right. This has won an event in the past, and it can just be very good. Chain Energy is at 3. You've got like Giant Germ, you've got things to bring out Giant Germ, you've got a lot of different things here to sort of set up your burn strategy. And, I do think it's seen success multiple times in the past, and, I think that it can continue to see success in the future. As time goes on, maybe this will get shifted a bit. Maybe, turns out good stuff is the best deck in the room and Burn cannot compete, but I do think that right now Burn is sort of the best deck that is not good stuff that you could be playing. So if you don't want to play a good stuff deck, then Burn is right there for you. Now, going through the other decks on the list, I want to mention like Banisher. Now, Banisher here was initially because I viewed like Banisher as just a deck play triple Banisher the Light, and as a sort of a separate deck from the good stuff deck. Maybe playing less graveyard line cards as well. But Banisher has actually become a very good tech card in just good stuff as well. It has 2k defense. It shuts off the Sangan and Witch engine as well. And if you play your cards right, it can be very, very powerful. So I do think because of that, I'm going to actually put the sort of Banisher-centric deck in tier 2. This is sort of like an accommodation because I don't think this deck really exists anymore. But I do think it's been incorporated into the good stuff deck. So it's kind of neat to sort of talk about it there. In the context of that. So I'm going to put in tier 2 to represent that kind of. It's kind of awkward because I'm sort of basing this off of past framework for a tier list that I did. In the future, I'm probably going to shift that, but I felt like since this video is kind of looking back at what I've done, I figured I'd use the old sort of images here for that tier list, but I think this probably belongs in tier 2 now. Next up, we get Empty Jar. Empty Jar, when I first did the tier list, actually was tier 1 because, I was like, well, this deck could be good in the future. Maybe people experiment with it more and do stuff like that. But I do think this deck's just hard rogue. The deck is not really that good. You do have Cyber Jar, which is powerful, and you can stall out the game a bit through various means, but like Cyber Jar on its own is not enough. And I just think there are like too many things going against this deck. And if you want to play an all win con deck, you kind of want to play Burn because it's just better. So yeah, Empty Jar Rogue, it could get better in the future potentially as people experiment with it more and try out new things. But Cyber Jar, Hero Scout, all that stuff, not good enough to make this deck higher than Rogue in my opinion. Next up, we got Clown Control, and this may surprise people, but I put this in tier 2. I don't know, above, I don't know. Yeah, I'm just going to put it in tier 2. The Banisher thing probably can just be at the top of tier 1 or tier 2 because it's kind of an accommodation for tier 1 deck. But Clown Control is very much its own strategy. And I do think this deck got a lot better from the previous format because you have many, many ways to protect the clowns now. You've got things like Rush Recklessly, which is very good. You can even do Floodgates if you want to, like Messenger of Peace, although I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. I think that the deck is just better if you're just using things like Rush Recklessly or other things to just protect the clowns in battle. But yeah, I think this deck is fairly good. I've like done a fair amount of playing with it, and I've done like decently well with it. So I'm going to put it in tier 2. It could potentially win an event here or there if people aren't expecting it, and if people come up with a good list for it. But it does suffer some consistency issues that the best deck in the room do not. The thing with what I think makes a tier 2 deck in this format, though, and what makes it potentially able to compete, is decks that can deal with set monsters. Because I do think that, like, Magician of Faith is so powerful in this format, and there are a lot of very good just set monsters, and also things like Mr. Tomato and things like that that are very annoying to deal with. So if you want to be a tier 2 deck in this format, you need to be a deck that can deal with monsters pretty well, and Relinquish is the other deck that can do this. I'm going to put Relinquish, actually I'll put it above Banisher. Banisher is getting weirder and weirder here. What does it represent? But I do think that Relinquish is actually a very good tier 2 deck. A lot of people have been trying this out and trying to bring it to a tournament win. I don't necessarily think it'll get there. Well, it might get there soon, but like it is just a very tricky deck to actually bring to a win. It does have some issues here, but the nice thing about it is that it plays differently from a lot of other decks in the format. It does deck thin a lot for you, so like your deck thing gets relinquished, and then you're got a higher quality of cards later on in the game. And also does deal with set monsters. It deals with your opponent's monsters as well. If it sticks around for a couple turns, then your opponent is kind of cooked. Like it is very strong there. It does have some flaws. It can brick here and there, and I played this in some past events, and generally I've lost because of the bricking, and so that is a downside to it. That's why it's not tier 1, but I do think it is very good, and people are playing around with this a lot, and so I do think it does belong in the top of tier 2. Exodia, trash here. I don't even know why I kept it on here in the original Treasure Format video. This thing is just awful. The hand rips just annihilate it. There's no way to get back. The Exodia piece after that, after you've been hand ripped, so... no, I think Monster Recovery comes out next set. So yeah, there's just no way to actually bring this thing back. Unless, actually, there is one way. You can play Hain and you Monster Reborn back ahead or a piece, and then you Hain it back to hand, but that's really bad. So this thing is basically unplayable. Next up, we've got Harpy Ladies. Harpy Ladies are probably worse than they were in Critter format. I'm going to put them in trash. I'm going to put them in top of trash. It's just because, like, Sisters did not do enough. And as I mentioned, like, decks you need to deal with your opponent's monsters. Harpy Ladies do not do that. Mr. Tomato beats over all the Harpy Ladies. Of course, doesn't beat over them in defense. But, like, at that point, why not just play Mass Sorcerer? It's just a better card overall. And the extension this thing does is not as impactful in this format. It does get Rising Air Current, which is nice for it. It does get Flying Kamakiri number 2, which is nice for it. Or number 1, I guess. But... it is unfortunately just not good enough here to be above trash, in my opinion. Next up, we've got Equip Aggro. I'm actually going to put this in Rogue. I know a lot of people are Equip Aggro believers. I just think that this thing is really bad in a format with triple MST, and people are playing triple MST. Maybe if people shift away from playing triple MST, playing more heavies instead, you can get away with this deck. But I think with triple MST in the format, it is really a tough ask because you'll be attacking in to your opponent's thing with a equip card on it, and then your opponent will just MST the equip card, and it's basically a battle trap at that point. And one of the nice things about this format is that it doesn't really have many battle traps. I mean, nice, your mileage will vary on whether you find that nice or not, but it is one of the notable features of this format. So giving your opponent a battle trap is not good. So I do think this card is Rogue. I don't really think it belongs above that tier. And so we get Hand Control. I think Hand Control is a solid tier 2. I think it's worse in this format than it was in the past format because you don't have things like Muka Muka. You also do already have the hand rips. So this is kind of putting a hat on a hat if you're playing Hand Control as well. But I think, like, Robin Goblin, just a good card in general in these formats. I think people have slept on it for a long time. But, with more exploration, people are realizing that it is pretty good. And even if it just loses to MST, you've, like, done a 1-for-1 trade on this card, right? You're not too upset about that, probably, at the end of the day. So I think this thing belongs in tier 2. If people shift away from playing MSTs, which there has been rumblings in the format about like shifting away from playing triple MST, playing 2 MST, 2 Heavy Storm, then, potentially this thing will become a bit better. But right now I'm going to put it in tier 2 below, it's probably above Relinquish if we're being honest. But again, it's like putting a hat on a hat. I don't really want to put it that much higher. So I'm going to put Relinquish at the top of tier 2. I think it belongs there. And lastly, we got Tunes. Tunes are just trash here. Tunes are really bad. You lose the Toon World and everything goes. Basically like Equip Aggro's flaws on steroids. And this thing is not good. It can't attack the turn summoned as well, which is a downside to it. If your opponent just leaves your tunes uncontested for a couple turns, you can just beat them down like very quickly. So that is nice for it. But like if they're not drawing into their spell and trap removal, they're probably drawing into their monster removal. So like it's very unlikely that this thing goes uncontested. And it's just very, very bad. Very funny deck, though. If you want to play an anime deck, it is a deck in the format for you, but, like, it is really, really not good. But yeah, I think that, like, as time goes on, I'm going to feature less and less decks in these tiers because I just get better at sort of cutting the wheat from the chaff. But I think this is a very, aesthetic tier list, and I do think it shows that, like, Treasure, there are a fair amount of tier 2 strategies that are a lot more unique than some of the tier 2 strategies in the past, which is one of the cool things about this format. Okay, next up, we've got Imperial format, the first 2003 format on the list. This is in February 2003. When I initially covered it, we were planning it in December 2002, but February 2003, planting in the flag there basically gives a couple more cards that don't really affect things that much. So, like, we figured we'd put it there, and so this is the first 2003 format that gets generally played. And it is a format that introduced Pharaoh's Servant, along with some other cards like Morphing Jar from Tournament Pack 2. And it is a format that is relatively popular from this time period, mainly because of community engagement, right? Like, we've got very passionate community members for this format who really do enjoy it. And so, because of that, they really do a lot of tournaments for it, and it's really, really fun. So I recommend, if you're looking for a very active community for a format of this time, Imperial is probably the format for you. That being said, if we're ranking this on enjoyment, I personally would put it in enjoyable. I don't think that this can necessarily rise above enjoyable for me. I also think that it might even be in Take Special sort of player for me, but I do think that, like, it is enjoyable because I think, like, from this era, games are generally enjoyable, right? Like, I think people like the back and forth. It doesn't have any glaring flaws like Yugi-Kaiba, although it does have some features that people might view as glaring flaws, but I think that generally they can be overlooked, and it is a fun time just playing Yu-Gi-Oh! I think it's fun. So I'm going to put in enjoyable. I don't necessarily think it reaches the great time levels of, like, Treasure, or even the peak Yu-Gi-Oh! Of Critter, but I do think it is enjoyable. And to explain why I think that, let's just dive into the tier list for it, and just talk about sort of my issues with the format, but also why I do enjoy it. Now, the main issue that I think Imperial has is that, in my opinion, this is actually the first Tier 0 format in the game's history. And that could just be because we've had more events for this format. Maybe if we do more events for Treasure or for Critter or something like that, maybe, it'll turn out to be that those formats are also Tier 0. But I do think that at this point, the sort of good stuff deck, which is been dubbed Tomato Control by this point, this deck kind of does take over as the best deck you can be playing. It receives some very powerful new tools like Imperial Order and also things like Jinzo, right? So you get access to these very, very powerful monsters that other decks do have access to, but you finally reach the point where, like, there's too many tools for a good stuff deck to have that makes, playing other decks kind of not really worth it that much. Yeah, so let me also just add one more deck to this list because for some reason I added Harpies initially, but it did not add here afterwards. Okay, now that the Harpy deck is on here, I do want to mention that, Harpies is a potential reason why people might not view this as Tier 0 because Harpies did indeed top one of the earlier Imperial format tournaments. So you could argue that, like, hey, look, a deck did top that's not Tomato Control. So, you should probably say it's not Tier 0. But that was a very, very small event, and I think that the deck has not replicated that success in the past. Maybe it's because the player playing it has not played it as much in these events, and they are a very good player with these rogue decks. But I do think that this is a firm rogue pick for me. I think that Harpies did not do enough in this format, just like it doesn't really do enough in the previous formats. Extension is nice, but that's kind of all this deck really has going for it, which is a bit of a flaw, I think, for the deck. So I just wanted to get ahead of that criticism because, like, I do think that, like, even though other decks have managed to top in some of these events in the past, these events are all very small. And the decks that consistently win and make it to the finals of the events are Tomato Control, because Tomato Control is just so dominant. Now, it's not bad to have a Tier 0 format. I think Tier 0 formats can be very fun. And I do think that, like, a lot of people do enjoy the Tier 0 deck that is in this format. And there is still a lot of innovation to be had in this deck. There are a lot of tech cards, things like that people can play. I mean, Fiend Mega Cyber was in this deck a while back and won an event. So there are a lot of cool things you can do with it. But I do think it doesn't change the fact that it is sort of the best deck in the room. It's the only really deck in town if you want to win an event. And so I do think this format is Tier 0. Now, that being said, I do think there are other decks you can play in the format, but I'm not going to put anything in Tier 1. I think it's just Tier 2 and below here. So starting off with Burn, I think Burn can be Tier 2. It's kind of just the same sort of thing that it was in Treasure format, except it does have some more competition with things like Imperial Order, just shutting off your burn spells, right? Now, Imperial Order does burn your opponent for 700 each turn, but it doesn't necessarily matter if they can do a bunch of plays on their turn, so they're still taking less damage than they would be if the chain energy was up. Also, a lot of people are playing MST even more than they are in treasure format because there are just so many good targets for MST in this format now. So I do think this format burn is a bit worse than it is in treasure, but it's still fine if you want to play it. Next up, we got Exodia. Exodia did get backup soldier, so that's something. I'm just going to put it in trash. If you lose the head, you're still dead. And so I do think that because this deck just has an instant lose button, is not really good enough to play. Next up, we got just like aggro. It's kind of like similar to how it was in Critter format, where you're just playing big guys, but now you've got Goblin Attack Force, which is a bit better of an aggro card. So I'm going to put that in tier 2 here. I think it can be pretty decent. Next up, we got Hat's Control. Hat's Control is a very, very cool deck cooked up when we first covered the format. Basically using Magical Hat as basically a Book of Moon, which does not exist in this format right now. And also as a Foolish Burial Goods to send like spells or traps to your grave. So you send a powerful spell or trap to grave, get it back with Magician of Faith or a Mask of Darkness that you flip down with the Magical Hats, and that's pretty good. The downside of this is that Knock is in this format and it is heavily played. So that is a bit of a, downer for people who want to play this deck, but I do think it's still a fun deck. I'm going to put in Rogue right now. I could potentially see more play in the future and could potentially get better in the future as people perfect it more, but I think right now it just doesn't do enough to raise into the tier 2 or above, sort of conversation. We got Empty Jar. Empty Jar, I mean, I think it's similar to Master Control. It has those same sort of flaws where like Knock is in the format. It's very good against this. There are plenty of counters to this deck in the format, but it is a bit better than it is in Treasure format because it has Morphing Jar now. It has Morphing Jar number 2 now as well. So it's definitely a bit of a better deck than it was before. Next up, we got Relinquished. I'm going to put Relinquished in tier 2. I think this deck did gain some things in the format, namely Call the Haunted, Premature Burial to bring back your Relinquished, which is very nice to do. Recurring Relinquished is very powerful. So I think this deck is a little bit better. I'm not sure if it's necessarily going to contest good stuff. I don't think it will. But it is still a fun deck to play. So if you're looking for a deck that, is not just the tier 0 threat that you want to play and potentially do okay with at a tournament, then Relinquished is probably the deck for you. And lastly, we got Hand Control. Hand Control, I'm just going to put, it's fine. Like, I'm just going to put it in Rogue. I'm going to put it top of Rogue. It's fine, right? Like, it rips card out of the opponent's hand. The issue is that, like, now there are more cards in the format that you don't necessarily want to get engraved because Call the Haunted and Premature Burial exist now. So if you rip, like, a Jinzo, right, they call it back, then that's bad for you. Also, Robbing Goblin shut off by Jinzo. And if you're putting that Jinzo on the field, Robbing Goblin getting in anyways. White Magical Hat's just really bad, I think, in this format. Yeah, it's just not really that good, but it can win games here or there. But yeah, this is going to be my tier list for Imperial format here. And, again, I do think this format's fun, right? Like, I enjoy the Tomato Control Mirror Match as much as the next guy, but I do think that because it is a tier 0 format, and because there are other formats that have a similar deck in it, but also more diversity, I can't really put it above those formats in my ranking here. So that's why I'm going to put it in enjoyable. Although, again, if you want one of the more active communities from this era of the game's history, that is the one for you. Next up, we're jumping to April 2003 for Android format. Android format is another tier 0 format, in my opinion, which I'll get into in the tier list discussion. But I do think it also is very enjoyable. It's a tier 0 format in a very different way from the Imperial tier 0 format. Like, it plays a sort of beast spellcaster list as opposed to just strictly Tomato Control, where you're playing like these 3 beaters, Bazoo, the Soul Eater, Kike the Ghost Destroyer, and Gemini Elf, which sort of form a nice triangle with each other, and each one sort of checks the other, and it makes for a fun time. I think it's a really, really cool format. I think it is like a bit, I think that both Id and Imperial are very fun in their own way. I do enjoy the tier 0 mirror match in Android a little bit better than in Imperial format because I think there's just a more to think about a lot of the time. And I think just having monsters be a lot better in Android format makes for a better time because in Imperial format, I think that the best things in the room are like traps and spells. Traps mainly because of Imperial Order. Imperial Order is just carrying the trap category entirely on its back. But like the monsters are not really the best. Like Jinzo is the exception there, but like that isn't really enough to, think about like, okay, well, I don't really have my good spells and traps here. I just have my good monsters. Am I going to win the game? Maybe not. But I do think in Android format, you can definitely win the game just off the back of your monsters because like the Kaiku, Gemini Elf, and Bazoo combination are just all very individually powerful on their own. And they do actually put a major clock on your opponent if they go uncontested. So I do think that, Android's where monsters really come into their own again after Critter. So it's kind of interesting, all these different sort of time periods where different sort of strategies or like types of cards really come into their own, because I think Critter was the first time for that for monsters where they actually became pretty good, and then androids when they actually become like very good. So I think it's kind of cool. I think it's a fun time. It's enjoyable. The Beast Spellcaster mirror matches are very fun, but don't go into this format expecting a ton of diversity. And speaking of that, let's go over the tier list just to sort of classify, if you do want to play some of the non-tier 0 decks in it, which ones you should go for. Firstly, as I mentioned, Beast Spellcaster, tier 0, in my opinion. The deck is just really good. Plays a bunch of good monsters. I mean, those monsters are just kind of very centralizing the format, because like other decks, you know, a lot of decks are just going for different boss monsters, right? But a lot of the boss monsters are just beaten by the monsters in the Beast Spellcaster deck natively. There are exceptions to this, but the exceptions are generally beat by other things, and the investment for those exceptions are not really worth it. So that's why Beast Spellcaster is sort of the best deck in the format. But there are other decks you can play. For instance, Necrofear is one that you could play. It's not really that good. I think I'm going to put it in Rogue. But yeah, it's just not really the best here overall. Fiends are kind of tough to come by. Generally, you play like Sangan and also Giant Germs, and that can get you to your 3 Fiends in Grave. But Necrofear itself is kind of too easy to play around, so it's not really the best thing in the world. Destiny board, just absolute trash. Awful, awful strategy in a format with so much spell and trap removal. So yeah, this thing is just really bad. Relinquished, I'm going to put it tier 2 or Rogue. It's definitely worse than it was in past formats. I'm going to put it in Rogue. Skull Lair is a card that also sees play in this format, and that can just pop or relinquish like nobody's business. So I don't really think it's that good. Next, we got Last Warrior from Another Planet. Turbo, this thing is just, again, a Rogue deck. Like, it's very, very hard to pull this off. And when you do pull it off, you got a good monster, but there's so much removal that doesn't really matter too much. I'm actually going to put this below Necrofear because I think it's harder to pull off than Necrofear. Next up, we got Water. Water, I think I'm also going to put in Rogue. A lot of Rogue decks, mainly because these are just new strategies that you can play that were introduced in Labyrinth and Nightmare, which is the new set for Android format. But, like, frankly, a lot of these are pretty bad. I think that Water is probably better than Necrofear and the Last Warrior Turbo because, like, it at least is... I mean, it's better than the others, right? Legendary Ocean is a powerful card. For a Water deck, Aqua Spirit gives you extension and can deal with certain threats. So, I think it's a bit better than the others, but it's still like not really on the level of tier 2 or above. Next up, we have Burn. Burn is, I'm going to put in tier 2. I think Burn can win games here and there and can be very powerful if in the right hand. So I'm going to put it in tier 2 there. Next up, we got Equip Aggro. I'm going to put this also in tier 2. It's much better than the other strategies here because it's just got very powerful equip cards. But the big downside is, again, MST exists and you're giving your opponent another battle trap here. So I think Equip Aggro is a bit awkward. Now, that being said, I do think it has some strength in the format because, for instance, one of the main ways of removing your opponent's monsters during their turn is through something like Trap Hole or Torrential Tribute. And the equip cards come after the monster is summoned. So that means that you can potentially, you know, get a monster around your opponent's removal in a way that other decks are not. But again, giving your opponent another battle trap with MST is not really that good. Princess Burn, this is a trash tier deck. Better than Destiny Board, but Destiny Board is like the lowest bar you could imagine. But Princess Burn is just much worse than Magic Cylinder Burn. Yeah, I mean, Magic Cylinder Burn isn't really even Magic Cylinder Burn, it's just Burn. But Princess Burn is just a convoluted combo that kills your opponent way too slowly to actually be worth it. Next up, we've got like Rat Box or just Recruiter Control in general. I think it's a tier 2 deck. Honestly, this should have been on the tier list for Treasure as well. So Treasure players, don't hate me for not having this there, but this should definitely be on that list. And it should probably be either top of tier 2 or bottom tier 1 for Treasure format. So a bit of an amendment there for the Treasure players out there, but it wasn't in the original list that I compiled there. But this deck is pretty good throughout the DM era. Basically, you're not just playing Mystic Tomatoes, you're also playing other searchers as well. And your mileage will vary based on like what other targets there are in deck for these things. But generally having more things that decked in for you, more things that give you field presence, even if they're attacked over, is pretty good, decent. And especially in this format where you want to get a bunch of things in grave for your Bazoos and things like that, this deck can be pretty good there. Next up, we got Mass Control Turbo. This is also going to go in the Rogue category. You can play this with Necrofear if you want to. I think it's slightly worse than Necrofear because it's just another thing to consider. Actually, it might be actually better than Necrofear. I'm going to put it above Necrofear. And the reason for that is Necrofear is much more easily edible than Mass Beast. Mass Beast is just a 3,200 attack point guy, and sometimes that is enough. So I'm going to put it in Rogue above Necrofear. And lastly, we got Empty Jar. Empty Jar, I'm going to put it in Rogue. I don't think anyone's really done a list that I've been convinced by. I'm going to put it at top of Rogue because I do think that if someone does come up with a list for this, then it could potentially be a tier 2 deck or something like that. But right now, I think just on the onus of people who want to play Empty Jar to come up with a good list because I don't think there's anything like too compelling that I've seen from this strategy in the past. But as you can see, like, even though Beast Spellcaster is on top, there are some rogue strategies you can play, which a lot of people are drawn to in this format. But just know that if you do want to win an event, Beast Spellcaster is the way to go here. Okay, next up we got Joey-Pegasus format, which is basically Android format, just with some more cards. Like, and you could argue that's like every format, but the more cards introduced are Graceful Charity and Sinister Serpent and Scapegoats and Harpy Feather Duster. So, like, I mean, those are some very impactful cards. And for me personally, I really don't like this format. It's got double Graceful Charity legal in it. And it's basically, like, in my opinion, a worse version of Android. And so for me personally, I do not like playing this. I put it in unplayable, but it does have a community of people who do enjoy playing it. And so by definition, it's not unplayable because people do like playing it. I'm going to put it in Takes a Special Sort of Player. I'm actually going to put it above the Yugi-Kaiba format. And it may seem surprising, but the reason for that is that I do think that there are more people who would be willing to play Joey-Pegasus format, which in my opinion is its main flaws are, like, there's just too much, like, sackiness with double Graceful Charity and not enough ways to unbalance just the first turn player going, like, Graceful Charity into hand rips, into IO, you know? Whereas the Yugi-Kaiba, it's like, you got to be willing to play, like, hour-plus long matches against, like, Sawmill. So I think there are more people who are going to be willing to play Joey-Pegasus format than Yugi-Kaiba format, but I still think, like, in my opinion, this format is not really as good as the formats around it. But again, people do like playing this format, and it is fun if you just want to, like, you know, just play some cards, like throw down some cardboard. It can be fun. Like, just, it is very much a format where, like, you're using Graceful Charity to draw through your deck, and, you know, if you're popping off in it, it can feel very fun. It's just like, it also is just a lot of power to the player who's popping off, and the player who's not popping off is probably in for a bit of a rough time there. But, you know, again, people do like playing it, so I'm going to put it in Takes a Special Sort of Player. Now, for the tier list here, you know, you could play the decks that I had in the Android format tier list in this format as well. Not really too much has changed, but I just wanted to sort of go through the decks that are, like, the most important that you might think about playing based on the changes to the limited list. Now, I actually think, unlike Android format, this is not a tier 0 format. And the reason I think that is because I think double Graceful Charity allows certain decks to have, like, a certain sack factor. So, like, any deck can pop off if it gets double Graceful, right? Which is fairly common. So I do think that, like, there's no one tier 0 deck because every deck sort of has so much power to just go through itself and get what it needs to actually win the game. So I don't think this format's tier 0. I do think that Tomato Control is still a very good deck. I think it's probably the best deck in the format, the most consistent deck in the format. You know, it's just very, very good. Like, you're just playing the good stuffs, right? And that's generally enough to win. But there have been some very, very good decks that have come out from this as well, namely, like, Hayabusa OTK or, like, Canberra, whatever you want to call it. I wouldn't necessarily call it very, very good. You know, it's definitely good. It's won events in the past, but I think largely it's won events because you just get that draw power in to go for your combo and set things up, right? And, you know, you have Scapegoat to pair with United We Stand and things like that, so you can get the power in that way. The issue I have with this is just, like, again, MST really screws your strategy if you're attacking him with Hayabusa Knight, and so it's a bit rough there. I think the most successful list of this actually only playing one Hayabusa Knight and just mainly relying on, like, Cannon Soldier and Scapegoat to sort of get a bunch of bodies on field to tribute off and also to fuel, like, United We Stand. So I think that Hayabusa itself is not really the best part of it, but because you have double Graceful and you have, like, Sangan and stuff like that, you can search out the Hayabusa very easily, and so you can pull off the Hayabusa OTK, like, in many different ways. And again, because of the double Graceful, it becomes a lot more consistent. So I think this deck is a tier 1 deck. Again, not quite as good as Tomato Control, but it's definitely tier 1 in my opinion. Now we get Exodia. Exodia is in the conversation here because you do have double Graceful Charity, so you can, like, draw deeper into the deck. I think this deck is still trash here. I think it's trash here. I'm going to say it. I know that you can potentially pop off with it occasionally, like double Graceful into drawing all your pieces. Whoa, that's cool, right? The issue with this is, again, if any of the pieces get ripped from your hand, yes, you have Backup Soldier to bring them back, but, like, it is a much harder win con for you. And if the head's gone, you're basically dead. You know, hit the head and then you're dead. So this thing is just really, really bad. I don't know really why you want to play it over the other things in the format. I've actually played this deck in a tournament just trying to test it to see, like, okay, can this deck actually pop off with double Graceful, or is it just still bad? And it is just still bad. It's not good. I don't recommend people play it. Next up, we got Ratbox. I'm going to put Ratbox, and this could just be any recruiter here. Again, like with Android format, just playing the recruiters is not bad. I'm going to put this in tier 2. You don't really need to deck then in this format because you've got double graceful. So like the recruiters don't really give you as much value. They do preserve your field presence, which is nice. And I guess they do slightly deck then to get into graceful charity or things like that. But like if you're going double graceful, like you're going to draw into a lot of these recruiters and you're going to have to pitch them. And that's always a bad feeling. So I feel like this is a tier 2 deck, but it could potentially rise up to tier 1 in the future. Next up, we got Burn. Burn, I think, is also tier 2 with the double graceful. And I know I keep saying with double graceful, but double graceful is important because it does really change the way the deck is played in this format, and it really does change what is viable and what isn't. With double graceful, people can draw into spawn trap removal a lot easier, which does hose Burn a bit. So I'm going to put Burn in tier 2 below Ratbox or recruiter-based decks. I do think it can win games here and there. It's a very tricky deck to play against, but I do think it is probably tier 2. And next up, we got Relinquish. I'm going to put this in Rogue. The reason why Relinquish is in the conversation here is because we've got both Scapegoat and Sinister Serpent in the format. So the idea is that, like, okay, well, you've got more ways to fuel your Relinquish tribute, but the problem with the Relinquish was never fueling the tribute. The problem was always your opponent removing the Relinquish afterwards, and also just having to put so many resources into it. Of course, this does alleviate the resource thing a little bit. But the thing is that after you've done your resources, what you care about isn't the monster you tributed, it's the ritual spell and ritual monster that you used up. So that is the issue with Relinquished. It's still not really the best deck in this format, in my opinion. I think it is Rogue because it can do things in interesting ways, but I do think it is just not quite as good, and it has sort of lost a little bit of its niche with Double Graceful being in every deck, because one of the nice things about Relinquished was that it did deck thin in a way that other decks did not. Now you don't really need the deck thing as much because you do have that Double Graceful, so I don't really think this thing is as good. But it's still a deck you can play if you want to. And again, as time goes on, maybe more decks will be discovered. Maybe more decks will reach the tier list. I just sort of put together this tier list based on like the decks that you might think are better or worse based on, you know, the releases that came out in the format. But I think this format is relatively active compared to some of the others. It's more active than Android format right now, I believe. So if you want a format from this time period, you could potentially dive into this one. I do think that like Android and Joey-Pegasus form like a block of similarity where like they are pretty similar, even though I do think that Android is generally more strategic. I think that Joey-Pegasus is a very fun way to relive like some of the iconic moments from just playground Yu-Gi-Oh! And playing with these decks. And it is not tier 0, which is a big boon to some people who really don't like tier 0 formats. So if you want to play in a form from this era that is not tier 0, you can play in this one. Although I would recommend that you try out the next one, because I do think the next one is a double graceful format that is actually a lot better than this one is. Next up, we got Fiber format. Fiber format is one of the biggest surprises on the channel. It is a format that, you know, was not really played until we covered it. And then people liked it so much that they made it actually one of the most popular DM formats in the game. And so it's very cool to see the success of Fiber format, which is the format held in July 2003. It is also a double graceful format like Joey-Pegasus, but it does have more balancing aspects like Fiber Jar to sort of reset advantage that people can get over time. And it is a bit more, I don't want to say it's more skill intensive because every format has its own skills that it tests, but I do think that it is, the games at least are more pleasant to me, right? There's less outright sacking than in Joey-Pegasus, in my opinion, and that makes it, for me, a great time. I'm not willing to put it in peak Yu-Gi-Oh! Yet. I think actually the next format for me is peak Yu-Gi-Oh! But some people do view this as peak Yu-Gi-Oh! And actually better than the next format that I'm going to be covering. But I do think Fire format is a great time. Very, very fun. Of the double graceful formats, it is definitely the better one for me because, like, again, you get less sacked a lot of the time. Like Fiber Jar is a balancer for that. And also just having more monsters that you can go into, more tools in your deck does make it a bit more of a fun time, and it does enable other strategies. So I like Fiber a lot. And let's dive into the tier list to see what decks you can actually play with Fiber if you do want to try it out for yourself. Okay, we got our Fiber format tier list here. And I actually think, like, just like with Joey-Pegasus, this is not a tier 0 format. Beast Spellcaster + Tomato Control is still, I think, probably the best deck in the room just because it's the most consistent, but there are other very powerful decks that have managed to contest its spot at the top of the list. One of those is Recruiter Swap. Now, Recruiter Swap, I would say, is probably still tier 1. It's getting to the point where it might drop down to tier 2 soon because it's not really putting up results at tournaments, but I do think it's still a very powerful deck if you play it right. Deck things for you. You get to do some crazy aggressive plays with like Mystic Tomato, Giant Rat, etc. And it can lead to some very, very cool games. So I think this format It's definitely not tier 0. Recruiter Swap is definitely in the conversation for a tier 1 spot. Another deck in the conversation for tier 1 is Burn. Although, I'm going to put it in tier 2. I think Burn is not quite level where it's reached tier 1. I don't think it's won an event yet, although I could be wrong about that. There are a lot of fiber events that happen. I actually might have won a single day event. Yeah, I don't know. I forget exactly whether it's won or not. But, okay, I actually did win a single day event. Yeah, I'll put it in tier 1. I'll put it in tier 1. I think it's above Recruiter Swap. And I think it could be even better in the future. Like, people can potentially innovate on it further. There are different ways to play it. And one of the nice things about Burn is that one of the only things that is not reset after a Fiber Jar activation is life points. So if you're burning your opponent, going through all your burn cards, and then you Fiber Jar to get 5 new cards, it's kind of like a Morphing Jar activation for the deck. And it resets all your opponent's progress on board. So I think Burn can be very good in the future and is pretty good now. Next up, we've got Fiends. I think this deck is Rogue. I don't really think it's that good. Hades is a powerful card, to be fair. But, like, I think the Fiend strategy itself is not really that good. And Fiber Jar resets your Fiends in Grave, so it resets your progress on Necrofear. So I don't really think it's that good. I'm going to put in Rogue just because of the power of Hades. But I think beyond that, it's not really something worth considering. Next up, we've got just, like, pure hand control with, like, Drop-Off and things like that. I think that this deck is probably tier 2. If you're playing Drop-Off is just a really bad card in this format. The reason for that is, 1, your opponent can, if they draw MSC, they can chain MSC to the Drop-Off. 2, it doesn't really do much against most situations. It's a random pitch, and it's not necessarily a random pitch that even you'd want to get. Like, for something like Robin Goblin, yes, that's a random pitch, but it's a random pitch from hand. So, potentially cards in hand that your opponent search out or things that they want to keep, right, that they've been holding on to for quite some time, which a lot of players do keep that in hand. Whereas with the draw, your opponent has not done anything to that card yet, right? So it could be a really good card, it could really be a really bad card. But if you think about the likelihood of hitting just a better card on the whole, generally ripping directly from hand is going to get you a better card than ripping directly from the top of the deck. So that's why I don't think Drop-Off's that good. And if you're playing a deck devoted to dropping off, yes, you can do some certain loops with Drop-Off and Time Seal and things like that. But I think the deck is probably not good enough to compete with the big boys here. So I'm going to put it in tier 2. Then we get Gearfried. Gearfried has won events in the past, but I think it's firmly a tier 2 pick. I think the deck just has some major flaws. And again, maybe with further experimentation, people will figure out ways to make this deck better. But I think that ultimately this deck is a bit flawed. Yes, Gearfried plus Blast with Chain is very powerful, and it can win games. But drawing one piece of the deck or another and not the complementary part of it can be just brutal. And it's just, Rhoda is also a powerful card. The deck does have some good things on paper for it, but it's not enough to get it to tier 1, in my opinion. I think it's time it's gone on. People have just realized how bad Gearfried actually is. And how bad it is not like in Rogue or Trash, but it is not really good enough to win a tournament anymore, in my opinion, that often at least. Next will be a Gradius. Gradius is a cool OTK. In playing it on the channel, I actually think it was better than I expected, but I do think it is still trash here. I'm going to put it at top of trash here because it's like better than nothing, but like it is still trash. Like, yes, you have Gradius' option. You can boost them up to big attack stats, but I don't really think it's that good. And you have to play Gradius, which is really bad in the deck. So I'm going to put in trash here. Last turn, I'm going to put in, I'll put in Rogue. People have been trying it out a bit more. I think the deck has some major flaws, but like people are trying it. It can win games here and there. But I don't really think it's good enough to win an event just because there are like side deck counters to it and things like that. And yeah, so I think it just does belong in Rogue. Dragons I'm going to put in Rogue as well, although at the bottom of Rogue, because people are still trying this thing out. There's experimenting with it. I think it can have potential. Super Rejuvenation is a powerful card. There's some good dragons in the format now, but like it's not really the best thing in the world. The dragons are not as good as like the warriors, for instance, or the fiends, for instance. So I think that this thing is in Rogue because it can win games here and there, but like it's generally not the best. Last we got Spirits. Spirits I'm going to put in trash here. I'm going to put it under Gradius' option, Turbo, but yeah, it's just not really the best deck in the world. It can do some interesting things, but the Spirits you have access to are not really the best, so I don't really think it's that good overall. But that's just my opinion on the format. Again, the format's constantly developing because you have monthly tournaments for it. And so that means that there is a constant evolving meta scene for it. So maybe in the future it will turn out that it's tier 0, like with further exploration, because a lot of these formats do tend towards that. But I think right now we're still at a point where it's not quite tier 0 yet. There is still a thriving metagame for it. And that's pretty fun. So I do recommend you play in the events for this format if you want to try it out. And as a note, I do think that this is better than Joey-Pegasus format as a double graceful format, but that's not to say that you have to play one or the other. You can play both, and that goes for anything in the video that I'm discussing right now, because I do think that, like, part of the fun of Retro Yu-Gi-Oh! Is that you have different formats that you can jump into when you feel like one format or another. So trying out as many as possible is good, just to see what you like, what you don't like, and just to follow your taste there. But I do think that if you're looking for a format to start out with from this era, Fiber is a pretty good one because it does have a thriving scene for it. Now, that being said, I do slightly prefer the format that's following after this format, so let's dive into that one now. Next up, we've got Yata format. Yata format is the format held in Worlds 2003. And it is a very fun format. I actually say it's peak Yu-Gi-Oh! Some people, I'm going to put it above Critter, actually, just for personal taste. Some people say that Yata is when the game got too sacky. Some people prefer Fiber to it because of that. But I think that Double Graceful is much sackier than, like, Mirage of Nightmare and things like that, which Yata introduces. Mirage of Nightmare is not everyone's cup of tea. But the nice thing about Yata is that all the power cards in it feel very balanced, right? In my opinion, right? The cards on their own are broken. Don't get me wrong. But what I'm saying is that when you actually play some games with Yata, the games oftentimes shake out into very intense, back and forths, where, like, everyone's playing around with the powerful cards, but the powerful cards are not broken enough where, like, just one player gets way far ahead, right? It's kind of like the Syndrome meme, where, like, if everyone has the power cards, then no one does, right? And it's kind of, Yata sort of exemplifies that for me. So I think this is, like, kind of the peak of the DM era, in my opinion. Just in terms of, like, if you want to go back and play the powerful banned cards that eventually will get banned, then Yata is the format for you, because there's just so much fun stuff you can do in this format. And I think the tier list does also exemplify that, because it is actually a surprisingly diverse format. One of the nice things about Yata format, in my opinion, is it's kind of where the game shifts away from just good stuff being the best deck in the room. And what I mean by that is you do still have decks playing a bunch of really good cards in them, right? Pretty much every deck is playing a bunch of staples, but it feels like a lot of the really good decks are sort of specializing in one thing or another. For instance, let's take Hand Control. Hand Control would sort of be the deck that people point to as the sort of good stuff deck. But you'll notice that a lot of hand control decks recently have actually been doing some very interesting things. Like, they're not playing Mystic Tomato, for instance, whereas a lot of people would view Mystic Tomato as a deck that belongs in good stuff because it gets you into your Sangan, your With Black Forwards, etc., and has been a staple of the deck for quite some time. Now we're at the point where people can actually make decisions about what to include in the good stuff deck, in that good stuff core, and sort of make some swaps or substitutions and sort of specialize their deck one way or another. And Hand Control is a perfect example of that. Hand Control is a deck that's specializing in hand control, basically, right? You're playing Dawn's Lugs, you're occasionally playing Spirit Reapers as well, potentially a Warrior package too, and you're trying to repart the opponent's hand. It's a very good deck in the format. And I think it's maybe the best deck in the format as well. But again, there still needs to be more experimentation because other decks have won events frequently. There's one really good player, Alpha 2. I mean, there are multiple good players in this format, but Alpha 2 has won multiple Yata events on a different deck every time. So that shows you that, the format is still very much unsolved. Maybe it's just Alpha 2 is built different and the format actually is just all hand control. But I do feel like, based on past results and based on continuing results, there is a fair amount of sort of diversity in the format. So Hand Control I do think is the best, though, as I mentioned, but there are some good decks as well. I think that Gravekeepers is actually potentially a tier 1 deck as well, and the reason for this is it won one event and then no one played it after, basically. So I think Gravekeepers, it's very, very cool. It does a lot of interesting stuff. Graveyard Spy, very powerful cards, bring out a card from your deck. Necro Valley shuts off a lot of meta cards like Monster Reborn, Call of the Hunter, Premature Burial, etc. Gravekeepers also has a Piercer in the form of Gravekeeper Spear Soldier. The deck actually had a lot of different tools available to it right now, and Gravekeeper Spy is just a really good card in retro formats. I mean, that's been shown throughout the years of retro format play, and it's true here as well. So I think this deck is very good. I think it's very slept on, but I do think it is a tier 1 deck. And I do think more people should try it out because there are some tools that haven't even been used yet. For instance, in the Gravekeepers list that won, Ray of Spirit was nowhere to be seen. Is that because Ray of Spirit is not really a good card yet? Or is it because it's just a slept-on tech that actually makes the deck even better? I don't know. But it is still pretty cool. So I'm going to put Gravekeepers in tier 1 here. Next up, we got Recruiter Swap. I'm going to put Recruiter Swap in... I don't know, tier 2. It's already on the bridge of tier 1 and tier 2 in Yata form, or in Fiber form, that is. And so I think here it maybe drops down to tier 2. I think actually one of the nice things about Recruiter Swap, and maybe a reason to put it in tier 1, is because the recruiters do crash into Dawn's Lugs very well. So you can trade that way. I'll put it in tier 1. I don't know. It's on the edge of tier 1, tier 2. I'm going to put it in the issue as well. It's kind of like with what I mentioned with the double graceful stuff, drawing into recruiters. The issue can be if you've got Mirage of Nightmare up and you draw into recruiters, that's obviously less good for you. But you can also use those recruiters to get into things from your deck that will then not be pitched off Mirage of Nightmare. So I'm going to put it in tier 1. I'm going to put it in tier 1. I'm okay with it being there. I'll have to see in future events if it actually managed to put up more results. Next will be a Gearfried. I'm going to put Gearfried in... I'm going to put it in Rogue. I think Gearfried, like, it has won events in the past. I don't think it will win again. Again, Gearfried feels really bad in Fire format. I think it's still bad in this format as well. There's other better warriors you can be playing. And the Blossom Chain combo, while good, does still lose to things like, you know... Well, it doesn't really lose to MST because you can activate and damage step. But there's a fair amount that it does lose to. And so it's just not really the best combo at this point. So I'm going to put in Rogue right now. Next up, we've got Burn. I think Burn is a tier 1 deck. Actually, I'm going to put Burn in tier 1 and the Recruit Swap in tier 2. I don't think tier 1 can be filled with too many decks because, again, I think that, like, you know, tier 1 has to be the decks that can win tournaments consistently. If there are too many decks, then no decks are winning tournaments consistently. So I think that there are going to always be, like, a relatively small subset of things in tier 1. So I don't want to build it out too much, but I will put the Burn deck in tier 1 because it's been putting up results lately. And I think that it is a very good deck. And it's a deck that's hard to play around and it's just continuing to improve and get better. So I think this is tier 1 and will likely continue to be tier 1. I'm going to put it above Gravekeepers because it has more recent results. It will likely continue to be tier 1 throughout the format's history. But again, more exploration is needed in this format. This format is criminally underexplored. I think it is very, very good. And so I hope more people try it out. Next up, we've got Metamorphosis-based decks. This could be light Metamorphosis. It could just be like Goat Control, kind of. You know, there's a bunch of different ways that you can build this deck. I think it is probably tier 2. I think it's better than Gearfried. But, you know, it is a bit worse than it will be in later formats. Just because it doesn't really do as much. But it's still fun to play, so I recommend playing it. Metamorphosis is really fun, and it could potentially be a deck that, with more optimization and improvement, does rise in the rankings in the future. Next up, we got Zombies. Zombies is Rogue, in my opinion. I'm going to put it above Gearfried. I'm going to keep it below Gearfried. The thing about Zombies in this format is that it doesn't have Ryukoki, so the best thing you're going into off the Zombies are, like, Patrician of Darkness. And that's if you're playing, like, if you're not playing Fushio Richie. Fushio Richie is just awful. That would be a trash tier deck. But the better version of Zombies that you'd play is probably just, you know, pure material for Patrician Darkness. And that's fine enough. I think it's not really good enough to get above Rogue, but it is still fine. Next up, we got Reasoning decks. I'm going to put Reasoning. I feel like Reasoning does go in Rogue. I was going to put it in Trash just to have a trash thing there. But then I was like, no, it's probably bottom of Rogue. Reasoning decks are a bit tricky to play. You've got couple different versions of them, like Machine Reasoning you could play. I mean, there's a variety of things you can do with Reasoning. It's just not at the point where it's good enough to see consistent results. The issue is if your opponent calls the right thing, then you're in a bad spot. If you just break on the monster that you want to hit off Reasoning, you're in a bad spot. The deck just cannot really put up results, and that's why it's at the bottom of Rogue for me, but it can still win games more than a trash tier deck can, so I do think it is still in Rogue. But that's going to do it for the tier list here. There are probably more decks out there that have not been discovered in the format because the format is still very underexplored, as I mentioned, and it is still a format that I think should deserve some more exploration in the future. So I highly recommend people to try it out for themselves. If you're a bit leery of all the power cards in it, trust me, once you actually play the format a bit, you'll realize that, like, the power cards are really not that bad in this format, and it's just a blast to play. Next up, we've got Scientist format or Breaker format or whatever you want to call it. I initially called it a Breaker format in my coverage, but in recent times, people have shifted over to Scientist to describe it. So I'm going to mainly call it Scientist from here on out. And that's what the community itself describes it as. But this is a format in November 2003 with the release of Magician's Force, which released Magical Scientist, which is at 3 copies in this format because apparently they felt this card was fine. In hindsight, this card is not fine. And Magical Scientist FTK is a deck that you will run into a lot in this format. And for that reason, I'm going to put it in unplayable. Now, the funny thing is that Scientist is not a tier 0 format, in my opinion. And also, just based on results that have happened, Scientist FTK, while a very good deck and a very consistent deck, is not consistent enough to potentially win a event, which makes sense because this deck is, at the end of the day, it does depend on, getting your pieces that you need for your combo and pulling it off. and you don't have Monster Gate in this format, so that makes it a lot less consistent. So it is definitely a deck that can lose a fair amount of the time and just lose automatically if you don't get the pieces that you need and your opponent has enough to just kill you. So I don't really think this deck is as good as people think of it historically. However, Triple Science has its own problems in the format. The card is busted, and it being everywhere just centralized the format around it. Like, even the decks that are not playing Scientist 50k do generally play Scientist, and I'm going to put in an unplayable. I know that people do play this and that there are tournaments for it, so maybe I should put in takes a special sort of player at the bottom of that, but I got to put something in unplayable, right? And so I will be putting Scientist in unplayable. I mean, it's just not, I mean, it's not really a good format. But that's okay. You know, if you look at the rest of the DM era, there's a lot of good stuff here. So having only one unplayable format out of the DM era so far, and spoiler alert, it will actually be the only unplayable format in the DM era, in my opinion, is a pretty good track record. Of course, as I mentioned, the format is not tier 0, so I do got to put a bit of a tier list here for it. Scientist FDK, I think, is in tier 1, but I don't necessarily think it's at the top of tier 1 because the deck has actually not really gotten much success at a tournament level in winning. Tomato Control has actually been much better, and Tomato is back in the picture now because Tomato can search out Scientist and search out a variety of things for your deck, keeps field presence for you, does a lot of things for you, so... it's a bit better than hand control in general in this format because the format's too fast for hand control to really thrive. This format really represents a jump in speed, which is something that's sort of been increasing over the course of Yu-Gi-Oh's history as more power cards get introduced. But this format takes it from, you know, a relatively brisk, you know, back and forth to just like the game ends in a couple turns and you better be prepared for that. So that's another reason why a lot of people don't necessarily like this format as much, because of just the jump in speed, not only due to the Scientists, but also due to things like Break with the Magical Warrior and Try Infecting Virus. But it is definitely, you know, you can play Tomato Control. I think that hand control is not necessarily as good here. But next up, we've got some other decks that I want to talk about here. Largely, these are decks that have just been played in past Science tournaments that I figured I'd mention. But most decks in this format are just either going to be Tomato or Scientist. There's not really much else that can thrive because if your deck's too slow, you lose to Scientist FTK. And so... the deck that beats Scientist 50k is mainly just a good stuff deck that is very, very consistent. Of course, Burn can also have a decent matchup against Scientist 50k because if you're burning them down, they get less Scientist activation. So this is another deck that can win against Scientist 50k. But the deck is not quite as good in this format when you got Break with Magical Warrior, being able to pop the back row. And yes, I know it's only one back row pop, but still, that is good enough to often make or break a game against a Burn deck. So I'm going to put Burn in tier 2 for now, and with more experimentation, maybe this rises up in the ranks. But if you're playing a Burn deck, you're probably just playing Scientist 50k. So this is more just a standard Burn deck as opposed to the Scientist 50k deck. Next up, we get Dark Magician Turbo. I'm going to put this... I mean, it has been brought to past events. Getting out a 2500 guy is pretty decent, but I'm going to put this in trash here. Sorry to everyone who liked the deck, but I do think that the deck is just not quite there. Because, you know, again, it comes down to the speed of the deck. Sure, if you summon out Skill Dark Magician, activate 3 spells that turn, then you get out Dark Magician, bam, you're in business. And if one of those spells lasts well, you get out a further extender, potentially even a Magical Scientist, and that's pretty decent. However, hands like that are not necessarily the most common thing in the world, and also, you know, you've put a lot of resources in basically bring out one guy, and if you're going to clear that guy, then you're in a pretty bad spot. So I'm going to put it in trash here for now. Maybe in the future, as more people experiment with it, it will rise to Rogue, but I don't really see it going higher than Rogue. Next up is Machine OTK. These are just decks playing like with limit removal and stuff. You can also play the XYZ Dragon stuff, which is kind of cool to see. Very neat deck for this time period. However, it's just a bit outclassed by everything else, so I am going to put it probably in trash tier. Do I put it above or below Dark Magician? I'm going to put it slightly above Dark Magician because it does have the speed factor on Dark Magician. But actually, limit removal is not, it's not searchable. So I'm going to put it in trash below Dark Magician, I think. But it is still a deck you can play if you want to. And it has been played in past events, which is why I, included in this list at all. But, the format is basically dominated by Tomato Control or Scientist. You just got to pick a side that you're on, basically. And maybe as more experimentation happens, this format will get better. But I'm making this format at the start of 2025. At the start of 25, I think this format is, pretty bad. I'm going to put it as the worst of the formats that I've covered so far. But again, people do enjoy it. So if you do enjoy it, don't take that as a personal attack. This is my opinion. This is a very opinionated video. So if you do enjoy it, I'm not saying even for people not to play it. I encourage you to try out this format and form your own opinions. Don't just take the YouTuber guy opinion as fact. Maybe you'll try it out and you actually do really enjoy this format a lot. I'm just saying for me personally, and I feel like for most people, this will not be something that they enjoy. But I do encourage you to try it out. One game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Is like, 10 minutes, 15 minutes maybe in this format. So like, it's not too much of an opportunity cost to actually try out. So I encourage you to do so and form your own opinions on it. Moving into February 2004, we got Vampire format next. And luckily, Vampire format, they did limit Magical Scientist, which is very nice. Magical Scientist FTK is still a deck in the format that you can play, but it's a lot less ubiquitous everywhere. So I do think Vampire format is pretty enjoyable. I'm going to personally put, it's tricky ringing it around Imperial and Android. I think it's, so the thing is, Vampire format, I don't think it's tier 0. I think that a lot of people view it as tier 0, but there are some decks that can compete against the tier 0 threat in the format, against the best deck in the format. So I don't really think that it is a tier 0 format. And for that reason, I'm going to put it above Android and Imperial. But that being said, the style of play is what keeps Vampire from being a great time for me. The thing about Vampire is that it is very, very tempo-based, very aggressive format. And so it plays differently from a lot of the other formats on this list. And because of that, I do think that it can't quite rise to a great time. Because for some people, it will be a great time. For some people, it will actually be peak Yu-Gi-Oh! But I think for the average person, I think it will be just enjoyable. And part of that comes down to the reason why people play retro Yu-Gi-Oh! In the first place. A lot of the times, people want a slower style of gameplay, whereas Vampire format is definitely not a slow style of gameplay. It is definitely a format that does still play with iconical cards and slower than the modern day, but it is definitely one of the faster formats among retro Yu-Gi-Oh! The main reason the format is so fast is because of DD Warrior Lady, which is at the center of a tier 1 best deck in the room strategy, Warrior Control. Now, Warrior Lady, because it's at 3 copies, basically the format becomes very tempo-based, where you're basically trying to use Warrior Lady to out your opponent's stuff while still having a monster on board to just provide yourself board presence. If your opponent uses a Warrior Lady to out your stuff, then you then have the initiative in summoning out an additional monster and attacking into their life points. So it's very much tempo-based, and I know tempo is sort of an ill-defined term in Yu-Gi-Oh! But, once you play the format, you definitely feel the tempo mattering a lot. And that's a skill that a lot of people don't necessarily value as much in more controlling formats. And so if you do really want to improve your skills with tempo, I do think that Vampire format is the format for you. And I do think that Warrior Lady catapults Warrior Control to tier 1. Now, that being said, I think that it's kind of like, what I mentioned for Treasure format, where if you have a deck that is going to be competing against Warrior Control, you need to have it be able to do certain things. And the thing that it needs to do in this format is out Warrior Lady. It needs to have some way of dealing with Warrior Lady. And, I think that the decks that do actually have a chance at doing that are things like Skill Drain Beatdown with Goblin Attack Force, and also Archfiends. And that's why I'm going to put both these decks in tier 2. I don't think they've proven themselves just yet, but I do think that they are very, very strong contenders for actually being a tier 1 deck, because they can deal with Warrior Lady. Terra King Archfiend negates Warrior Lady's effect if it destroys by battle, and Skill Drain, while it's up, will stop the Warrior Lady effects as well. And it will also give you a 2300 beater that is hard to deal with. So I do think that these decks are both tier 2. I think that they could easily rise to tier 1 in the future with more experimentation, but Vampire format is a format that does not have many tournaments at all. So hopefully we can get some more tournaments for this format in the future, in this year. But I do think that these are strong contenders if you do want to play around in the format and not just go with the standard white bread, Warrior Control deck. You can play around with these guys and potentially see success. Now, the other tier 1 deck that I do want to mention that I do actually think is tier 1 is Burn, Panda Burn specifically. Panda Burn is a new deck in the format and is pretty good in my opinion. I think it's a very tricky deck to play against. And while it doesn't really have a way to, like, in archetype deal with Warrior Lady, generally you don't care because you're just trying to get in for damage, right? And as long as you're getting in for damage, that's what matters. Warrior Lady removes herself from the field, so you will potentially have, pot shots direct, or you'll just be able to buff up your pandas with things like Ojama Trio and things like that. So I do think that Panda Burn is pretty decent here. And we'll actually have to see how it does in the future. Next up, we get into the decks that I think are Well, some of them are potentially good, but I don't really think that you'll see too much of them in events. Medical Science FTK, you'll probably see at least one person on this in an event. I think it's probably Rogue actually now. Science is limited, but again, this can always potentially win in an event or a game. The issue with it, in my opinion, is consistency. I think with only one scientist, it becomes a lot less consistent. And while you can still pull it off occasionally, the lack of consistency keeps it out of the top tiers, in my opinion. Because especially since a lot of the decks in this format are very aggressive, and they're just going to beat you down while you try and assemble your combo. So I think Science FTK, probably Rogue tier. In the future, if it sees more success, maybe it could rise. But I think that just based on consistency issues alone, it is Rogue. Next up, we got Exodia Necros. That's trash. This is just a new archetype that came out in the set. Really bad. And there were some other new stuff that came out in the set, like Final Countdown and, Butterfly Dagger Elma FDK potentially. But, I think those are kind of just worse alt win cons than Scientists. So I'm just kind of, those would just be in trash or Rogue. I'm not going to go through all of them, though. Actually, for the video on them, I just put them into one video because they're all sort of similar in my mind. And so I think they're all just Rogue or below. So don't worry. Aren't going to be too many FTKs running around. Although Scientist FTK is something that you do have to worry about. It's not the most consistent deck in the world. Next up, we've got sort of a Tsukiyomi, Yata lock at home sort of deck where you're playing Tsukiyomi and Mask of Darkness to just keep recycling Time Seal. It's fine. It's probably Rogue. I don't really think it's the best thing in the world, but Tsukiyomi's a powerful card, so it's probably Rogue. Yeah, I'm just gonna put it in Rogue. I don't think it does enough to crack into tier 2 or above because again, it doesn't really deal with Warrior Lady. So you could argue that it is kind of dealing with Warrior Lady because it's preventing them drawing the Warrior Ladies, but I think it's still just Rogue. And also we got Zombies. Zombies is Rogue in my opinion. This deck is sort of the key point why a deck needs to deal with Warrior Lady because Zombie you would expect, given the format's name is Vampire, and given how hype Vampire Lord was at the time, that a deck playing Vampire Lord Turbo would be pretty good. Vampire Lord is actually a really bad card in this format. Really banishing it just means that, you're losing a lot of value on going into it. Also, really banishing your Pyramid Turtles is really bad. So, it's just kind of awkward overall. And also, sort of another side of this that it can not really be as thought of is that, if you're just attacking the Warrior Ladies and they're just being banished all the time, your opponent might not even have monsters in graveyard for you to activate Book of Life to bring zombies back. So that's another tool that the zombie deck has that's taken away from it. So zombie is not really good in that format. So I think it is just a Rogue deck. But as you can see here, I think the format is relatively vibrant and diverse. It just had no tournaments. It had some tournaments, but the tournaments are very few and far between. So unfortunately, it just has not had the experimentation and the attention it deserves, in my opinion. But I think it is fun, and I think it is enjoyable, and so I hope people do try it out more, and maybe in the future it could even rise to a great time or beyond, depending on how it shakes out. But I do think that right now it is still a very enjoyable format, and one to try out if you want to get better at tempo in these old formats. Next up, we've got one of the most iconic formats in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, the format that changed Yu-Gi-Oh forever, Chaos format. So the format with Chaos Emperor Dragon, Black Leather Soldier coming out in Invasion of Chaos. And while some people may say that, Ancient Sanctuary should be added to this, generally Invasion of Chaos is the standard that people set. Actually, if you add Advanced Sanctuary or Ancient Sanctuary to this format, it becomes a lot worse somehow. But I think that Chaos, it's a fun time just slamming down cards, slamming down power cards. It's kind of similar to Joey-Pegasus in the amount of sack that is in the format, but in my opinion, Chaos format is generally more fun than Joey-Pegasus format because the sack manifests in different ways each game. So, it's still keeping you on your toes, and it can be pretty fun. And you're playing with some of the most iconic cards in the game's history. Do I think it's a great time? Well, your mileage would vary on that, but I personally find it to be a great time, but I think I can only in good conscience put it in enjoyable because it is so sacky. I think the great time formats need to have some element of, back and forth gameplay at a more strategic level, and Chaos format does have that. It does take skill to play any of these formats, honestly. Any Yu-Gi-Oh format, it's going to take some skill to win at, consistently at least. But I do think that Chaos format is just enjoyable because there are so many opportunities for you or your opponent to sack just out of their minds. And so I do think it's enjoyable. But again, enjoyable is not a bad thing, right? I think this format's very fun. And I would even just outright recommend things to people from enjoyable and above. Just because I do think they're just fun on their own formats, And I don't think that they're something that people would just outright hate on their own. So yeah, I guess another way to view this tier list is that Takes a Special Sort of Player is formats that I only recommend to people who I know the tastes of and know that their tastes align with it. Enjoyable is formats that I recommend to everyone. Great Time is formats that I would actively try and get people to play, and then peak Yu-Gi-Oh! Is formats that I would actively try and proselytize people to actually becoming, really, really into this format and promoting it themselves. So that's sort of another way to view it. And then unplayable formats I would not recommend to people. But yeah, let's dive into the format tier list for Chaos. I'm sure this will not really be too surprising to many people, but it should be pretty straightforward, but there will be some surprises here and there on the list. Now, Chaos is viewed as a tier 0 format, and I think as of now, it still does have its spot as tier 0 at this point, although time will tell because there are some decks that are rising up to rival it. Normally, I don't put decks in tier 1 when I have a tier 0 format, but I do think that things like Jar Turbo, that is potentially a deck that can rival Chaos. I think Earth Aggro, I'm going to put Earth Aggro in tier 2 because I think it can rival Chaos, but like it hadn't had the results yet to actually, say like convincingly like, okay, this is a deck that can rival it. But there are some decks that can compete against Chaos and potentially be things that people can experiment with in the future. So I could definitely see Chaos falling down from tier 0 just to tier 1 in the future. But if you don't know, Jar Turbo is a deck that is just a crazy combo deck trying to pull off insane DMOC OTKs. So just you got 3 DMOCs available to you. And if you can get those in rotation, doing stuff with them, then you can kind of go crazy with the deck. And the deck has seen tournament success in the past. It hasn't won an event yet, but it's gotten to second place multiple times. And so I do think the deck is pretty fun. And it is something that could potentially rival Chaos and potentially make it non-tier 0 anymore. But as of now, we just haven't reached that success just yet. And Earth Aggro is a deck that I've played personally myself, and I think it's pretty good. It operates on a different axis than some of the other decks, and it's just trying to kill you before you can actually set up your Chaos stuff. So that's pretty decent, in my opinion. Next up, we got Chaos Turbo. This is just a deck that's, going all in on Chaos monsters, including Chaos Storks and, all that stuff. I think this deck is also tier 2. I'm going to put it below Earth Aggro. It's not as good as the Chaos deck that's just playing CD and BLS, because CD and BLS are much better than the Chaos Storks, and the Chaos Stork can brick in hand. In a format like this, you really don't want bricks in hand. Next up, Science of Decay. I'm going to put this in Rogue. I mean, again, just like with Vampire, it can win games here and there, but it's not consistent enough to do well, consistently in events. Next up, we've got Metamorphosis style decks. So this could be like Goat Control or something like that. You do have Tsukiyomi now, so Goat Control is sort of how it looks in its more modern form. I think this deck is probably, it might just be Rogue. It's a bit too slow in a format like this. In a format like this, you really need to be aggressive, so I'm just going to put it in Rogue. Next up, we've got Gravekeepers. This is sort of just like an anti-Chaos deck because Necro Valley shuts out the Chaos stuff, but a lot of the Chaos decks in this format don't necessarily need to rely on their graveyard alone, and there are enough things to clear the Necro Valley that like it's not really going to be sticking around too often. So I think that this is just a Rogue deck as opposed to a tier 2 or above. Next up, we got Warriors. I'm going to put Warriors in tier 2. It's kind of similar to Earth Aggro and how it can operate, but I think it's just not quite on the level of Earth Aggro in terms of aggressiveness to actually beat Chaos decks most of the time. But I do think it is like a very, very solid deck. So I'm going to put it in tier 2 because of that. Next up, we got Levia Dragon, Daedalus stuff. This deck is really bad. They're just better boss monsters that you can make, and blowing up the board is done better by CD anyway. So this thing is just in trash here. Next up, we've got Zombies. Zombies do have Ryukoki now, but I don't think that's enough to keep them out of the Rogue tier. I'm going to put them below Necro Valley because I don't really think they're that good. Going for a 2400 boss is fine and will be better in later formats, but in this format, it just doesn't quite cut it. Next up, we got Burn. I'm going to put Burn in tier 2. I'm going to put it near the top of tier 2, under Earth Aggro. Earth Aggro is mainly here just because of my personal bias. Just keep that in mind. But Burn is a pretty good deck in the format. Like, I mean, I don't know. Burn just operates how it does on its own axis, and, that axis is sometimes good enough because people are not expecting it. But I don't think this deck is really contesting Chaos anytime soon. I don't think it's going to be able to compete with it alone, but it's still a good deck that can get you some success in events. Lastly, we got just Yata Turbo, which is basically just trying to set up the Yata lock as much as possible. The Chaos Yata lock was a fearsome combo back in the day, but in modern testing, I feel like the Chaos Yata lock combo is actually very, very hard to pull off. And a lot of Chaos decks actually cut Yata entirely. So this is a deck that's basically trying to do it, maybe including things like Time Steal or Drop Off or things like that to also just deprive their opponent of even more resources to set up the Chaos Yata stuff. But like, I don't really think that's that good. I'm going to put it in Rogue actually. Maybe it should go, I'm going to put it at the top of Rogue. It's basically a worse Chaos deck is the thing. And I think it's worse than Chaos Turbo as well. I think a lot of the more consistent decks will just beat it because it's just drawing into things that, while they're not bad, are not particularly good either. So I don't think it's really that good. I'm going to put it in Rogue. And that's going to be my list for Chaos format. Again, I think this could change in the future. Maybe Chaos could get bumped down to Tier 1 if people continue to iterate on Jar Turbo. But for now, at the start of 2025, this is what the format looks like in my opinion. Next up, we have the end of the DM era Warrior format. Warrior format is, in my opinion, peak Yu-Gi-Oh! I'm going to put it in peak Yu-Gi-Oh! I'm going to put it above Critter, personally, just because I like Warrior format. I like the diversity of it. I like how it feels like GOAT format, but like an alternate version of GOAT format that sidesteps some of the issues that GOAT format's been having recently. And I think Warrior format's a very fun time. I think if you enjoy GOAT and want something a little bit different, Warrior's for you. It's the format held basically, right before GOAT, at the ban list before. So it's held in used the October 2004 list, but it held at the SJC Columbus in 2005, and that's February 2005. And its list is actually surprisingly different from GOAT. It doesn't have some key pieces of the Trinity, like Graceful Charity's banned, Delinquent Duo's banned. It replaces it with other things as well that GOAT players might find a bit unpalatable, but in my opinion, they actually balance out kind of nicely, and they're not as degenerate as people think. So I highly encourage people to check out Warrior format. If you love GOAT format, but you feel it's getting a bit stale, Warrior format's still very underexplored, and there's still a lot of decks running around, and that do have potential to actually be very good. Well, let's dive into the tier list and discuss my thoughts further. Now, if you've been following Warrior format, over the course of its history, you'll know that the most recent event in Warrior format was actually won by Scientist FTK. So I want to get that elephant out of the room. I'm going to lump that in with Makura the Destructor for just FTK style decks that can potentially just win games here. I think these decks are rogue. I'm going to put that out there. Again, this is my opinions on the formats, not necessarily based entirely on results, because results can be flawed in formats that are very small. And I do think that the deck winning is pretty good for it. I don't think the deck is trash, right? Like, I think the deck can win. It obviously won the event. But if you look at how small the event was and how many games it won, if the format ever grows to be actually much bigger, then I think the deck will suffer. And I also think that, like, based on my own personal testing of the deck, it can win somewhat, like, frequently, but it also is not as busted as in, like, Scientist format, right? I don't think it's at tier 1. I think other decks can counter it in pretty good ways. And I do think that a fair amount of luck is involved if you want to actually bring it to an event and actually do very well with it. So I'm going to put in Rogue for now. In the future, maybe if more people consistently top with Scientist, FTK, and bigger events, maybe I'll bump it up to tier 2 or even tier 1. But I think right now it is Rogue. I don't think I can place it above that in good conscience, based on just one tournament being won by it. But, people go back and forth on this stuff. And again, the format's very underexplored. Maybe it is actually much better, and maybe, the format's cooked because of it. But I think right now, we're not at the point where we can really say that so far. And so I encourage you to try out the format for yourself, and not just, let the fact that there's an FTK that can potentially win in it deter you from it. Because I do think that the format is still extremely, extremely good. I mean, it is peak Yu-Gi-Oh! In my opinion. And so I do think more people should play it and try it out. Now, speaking of Science FTK, there are also Read and Gate decks, and I think these Read and Gate decks are probably tier 2. I think they're above Science FTK for the reason that it's not all in on the combo, right? Read and Gate decks do have some degree of variance no matter what format you play them in. And I do think that, you can definitely draw brick hands that lose you the game. But compared to the Scientist brick hands, Read and Gate decks are a little bit better in that regard. So will this deck, win every game it plays? No, it will not. But I think on average, it will still be a bit of a better experience for you than Science 50K, because you have a bit more flexibility in what you do. And it's still very strong in this format. I think that Read and Gate Turbo is potentially better here than it is in GOAT, although that's a bit of a controversial take. But I think the way the stars align for the deck do make it a little bit better here. But I don't know. There's a lot of thoughts on this stuff. And maybe in the future, this will drop down to Rogue. But I've had decent experiences with the deck in the past. I think the deck on paper is still pretty good. And I do think it's a little bit better than Science FTK, in my opinion. But moving on into the other decks here, let's just talk about Warrior, because the format is named Warrior. So you think Warrior is a good deck, and Warrior is still a very good deck. It is a good deck in the format. I don't think it's the best deck in the format, although opinions on what the best deck is go back and forth. I do think it's a very, very good deck in the format, and so it does belong at the top of tier 1, but I do think that Goat Control has sort of been given a run for its money lately. I'm going to put Goat Control actually a little bit above Warrior here, just because on past results, I know that I didn't want to make this results-based video, but I think that these decks are kind of neck and neck. So the tiebreaker for them being neck and neck will just be that Goat Control has been winning some events in the past. And I do think that Goat Control is a good counter to Warrior. It does have some flaws compared to Goat's version of Goat Control. For instance, the battle position change rules are different in Warrior format, which does hurt the consistency of your Tsukiyomi setting down 1,000 strict combo. But it's still very good format, or a very good deck in the format. And it has done well in past events. So I'm going to put it top of tier 1. And again, I think it's just good on its own merits as well, not just going based on the event. I think it is a good deck as well. So anyways, next up, we dive into sort of the other cards, or the other decks in the format, that is. Actually, I'll put in one more tier 1 deck right now. I'm going to put in Burn. I think Burn is a tier 1 deck. It's had some success at past events, but Burn is one of those decks that the more you play against it, the more you figure out how to play against it. And I think this format is still kind of young, so I think a lot of people playing don't necessarily know how to play against Burn necessarily just yet. So as time goes on, this could definitely fall in the rankings. But I think right now it is still a tier 1 deck, but I'm going to put it near the bottom of tier 1 right now. Next up, we got Water. Water, I think it's tier 2. It has done pretty well in the past, and also it is a pretty flexible deck. There's a lot you can do with it, and its combos are kind of cool, and it can make some weird things happen. So I'm going to put it in tier 2. I don't think it's quite got the consistency of some of the tier 1 decks, but I think it is. It's probably above Reason Gate Turbo. Maybe it's below. I don't know. I think Reason Gate Turbo has a higher ceiling, but like the Water deck is probably more consistent overall. So I don't know which one should really be above the other, but I'm going to put it like this for now. Chaos Turbo. Chaos Turbo is a deck that I think is at the top of tier 2. I don't think it's quite tier 1 yet, and that may seem surprising if people come from GOAT format, and maybe with more experimentation, this thing will rise up in the ranks. But I do think that there are some key factors in this format that prevent Chaos Turbo from being as good. One is that confiscation's in the format instead of Delinquent Duo. So Thunder Dragon is a lot worse here than it is in GOAT format. Another is that just the layout of decks in the top cut kind of go against Chaos Turbo a bit more. But, you know, Chaos Turbo does have some benefits in this format. You know, it's got Mirage of Nightmare, which is very powerful, setting up the graveyard. It's got triple Night Assailant, not just 2, so you can do more Night Assailant plays with it. I think the deck is very good. It's just, I don't really think it's quite at tier 1 just yet. Maybe with more experimentation, it will rise in the ranks a bit more, because, you know, the cycle of GOAT format, the way the GOAT format went was people thought Goat Control was like the best deck in the room, but then over time, Chaos Turbo turned out to be the best deck, and more people tested and got better at the deck. So maybe the same thing will happen here. I don't know. But right now, I think that the deck is firmly at tier 2. Next up, we have Stein OTK. Stein OTK, I'm going to put in Rogue. I'm going to put it under the Science FTK decks. I think this deck is not quite as good here, but we have seen in GOAT tournaments that Stein OTK has been putting in work in that format. So maybe adapting the Stein OTK strategies from those formats to here might be a bit better and might make this deck rise up in the ranks. But for now, I'm going to put it in Rogue, and I'm pretty comfortable placing it there because the deck is just not quite as good as other decks in the format. Next up, we got Gearfried. Gearfried back again. I think Gearfried is not really that good. I think it's in Rogue. I'm going to put it under the Stein deck, but it is a deck you can play. I mean, this is a lower power level than some of the past formats that sort of wiped out Gearfried's competitive nature. But I think here, it still is Rogue. I don't think it's really the best deck in the world. Next up, we got Horus. Horus, I mean, just like with Stein, it has seen success in GOAT format. So, like, it maybe is better than we're giving it credit for, but I think right now it probably does just belong in Rogue tier. I'm going to put it below Stein, but that's not to say it can't ride in the future, but right now I don't think it's quite as good as it will be later. Zombies, again in Rogue. I'm going to put it above Science FTK. I'm going to put it below Science FTK. Science FTK won an event, whereas Zombie did not. Zombie just like, you can go into Koki, that's good, but like, is it good enough in this format? Generally not. So I'm going to put it in Rogue there. Next up, we've got Return decks. So this could be like Bazoo Return or things like that. I think Return decks are pretty decent here. I'm going to put them in tier 2. I think they're very flexible. And, you know, you still do have Chaos Monsters to fuel the return stuff. You've got Bazoo to fuel the return stuff. And Return can just catch the opponent off guard out of nowhere. So I'm going to put it in tier 2. I think it's pretty good here. Last, we got the Creator decks. I'm going to put this in tier 2 as well. I don't know where to put it in tier 2. I'm just going to put it here in the bottom tier 2. I think the deck is very good. It's very neat. It's another way to play the Warrior stuff, but also there's a lot of things that you can pair with the Creator to get some great value off that graveyard effect. So I think that the Creator is a bit of a slept on card in this format. And this deck really took the Warrior community by storm when it first was created and managed to get an event. It hadn't really done much since then. So again, just like with Science FTK, I'm not going to put it like way up here or something because it's one event, because that event was also pretty small. But I do think that like it is potentially something that people can experiment with more in the future and potentially rise up in the ranks a bit here. It could also potentially fall in the ranks. It could potentially go down to rogue. But I think right now, given that not many people have tried this out, I think it's still quite unknown what status is, unlike with Science FTK, where people try this out, Science FTK, like every format or every tournament that is, and it has not done well until the last event. And also, I've tried out Science FTK pretty extensively as well, not just in this format, but other formats as well. It just doesn't quite have the gas, I think, compared to like the creator deck. But like, I mean, again, this can change over time. If more people manage to win or top with Science FTK, it can rise. If more people don't do anything with creator, maybe it can fall. I don't know. It's still an open book. Warrior format, part of the allure of it is that there is still much to discover here, even though it does feel very similar to GOAT format. So I'm excited to play around with the format even more in the future, and I hope we get more events for it because it is a blast to play. Next up, diving into the GX era, we've got GOAT. Yes, GOAT is a GX era format, and I think GOAT is peak Yu-Gi-Oh! I'm going to say it. I mean, like, it's hard to debate that at this point. GOAT is one of the most popular formats in the game's history, and it's very, very good. For me personally, I place it below Yata and Warrior. Warrior mainly because it's so underexplored right now, and there's still lots to discover, and it's very fun. And GOAT's also very fun, but I like the allure of Warrior in that regard. But I mean, honestly, people could put it at the top of the list, and I wouldn't, debate that. Like, I think it's peak Yu-Gi-Oh! No matter how you slice it. A lot of people say, oh, it's all just Chaos Turbo, so GOAT format's kind of cooked. People don't like it anymore, blah, blah, blah. But you see some events, and they're won by decks that are not Chaos Turbo, like the Stein Horus list that won recently. And so I think there's still a lot to discover in GOAT format. And even if the format was all Chaos Turbo mirrors, those mirrors are really, really fun and really, really good. And there's always going to be things that can contest Chaos Turbo, like Earth Aggro, like Warrior, like even GOAT Control, which still sees play to this day somewhat. So I do think that GOAT is just peak Yu-Gi-Oh! I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. And honestly, the ordering of the things in these tiers are largely due to personal preference. I mean, these tier lists are all personal preference, but especially when it comes to the ordering here. So GOAT fans, don't take umbrage at the fact that I put GOAT Control third. It's just there for now. And again, could easily be the top of someone's list. I wouldn't debate that because the GOAT format is just that good. I'm not going to do a tier list for GOAT format, though, because I feel like there are plenty of GOAT content creators out there who can do better GOAT tier lists than I can. So I'm not going to, thrust my foot into the door there. I'm going to let other people handle that job for you. And I'm sure there will be plenty of GOAT format tier lists coming out at the start of the year anyways. So moving on to the format after GOAT format, Cyber format held in SJC Boston right after GOAT format with the release of Cybernetic Revolution. Cyber format actually used the same ban list as GOAT format, but the cards from Cybernetic Revolution really do change it quite a bit. And also the fact that it makes Stein very good. So I am actually going to place this, and you'll see a lot of formats start to go here. I'm going to place it in Takes a Special Sort of Player. The reason for that is Stein decks really do warp a lot of the formats in this period of the game's history, right? And I can't necessarily in good conscience recommend these formats when Stein is so dominant in them, because a lot of people do not like Stein. That is sort of the downfall of like Reaper format, which we'll discuss next, where Stein sort of goes in, centralizes the format around itself. Even if it's not the best deck in the format, it's the deck that everyone's trying to beat and has on their mind. And when that becomes such a feature of a format, it does make things a bit awkward. Now, Cyber format sort of is not quite as bad, it seems, as some of the other Stein formats. Mainly just based on tournament results and how people enjoy it. A lot of people view it as an alternate version of GOAT as opposed to an alternate version of some of the other Stein formats that come later. So, it's not necessarily as centralized around Stein as some of the others, but I think over time it'll just become more centralized around Stein because that's the pattern with Stein formats. They just become more and more centralized around Stein. And so I think it is just going to be in the Takes a Special Sort of Player category. So, but, again, Stein is not the tier 0 threat in the format. So let's actually dive into a tier list for it and talk about the different decks in the format. Now, I think for Cyber format itself, Stein Monarch is definitely going to be tier 1. I think Stein Monarch is going to be kind of tier 1 in pretty much all the Stein formats because this deck is just so powerful at bringing out Stein and a big fusion monster and just OTKing your opponent out of nowhere. Now, in this format, it's a bit worse because Last Will works a bit differently. It works the way it does in GOAT format. So you can't just activate Last Will before or after you send a monster to grave. You have to actually activate it before and also immediately when that monster gets sent to grave, you then have to bring out the monster. But it is still a very powerful deck in this format. It actually managed to win a past event. And it's still very good. You know, this is a centralizing deck in the format for a reason, because it's very powerful. However, it has not been doing as well in more recent events. Now, there could be a couple of reasons for that. Maybe people don't want to play the deck. Maybe it's just other decks are actually better than it. And because of that, I am going to play some of those other decks in the tier list a bit higher than it. So I'm going to put Goat Control and Warriors a bit higher than the Stein Monarch list here. I think both these decks are potentially more consistent, a bit better. And they also do kind of counter Stein OTK a bit. Warriors can get aggressive enough to deal that 3k damage that you need to get them out of the 5,000 life point threshold they need for Stein. And Goat Control has Scapegoat in it, which can block off a Stein push. Of course, you know, if they go Cyber End Dragon, you're taking 4,000 damage, but you're probably not losing the game. You're just taking a ton of life points. So both these decks are very good, and I think they do belong above Stein Monarch in the tier list based on how the events have been going. You know, again, these events are in very small communities, so as we grow out things more, maybe that'll shift. I mean, if you look at Reaper events, Reaper, people thought that Stein Monarch was potentially not a problem until events got bigger and bigger, and while Stein Monarch didn't win those events for the most part, it did manage to be competitive enough that many people were bringing it, and it kind of ruined the feel of those formats. So maybe if this grows bigger and bigger, maybe Stein Monarch will rise up in the ranks or potentially just be a big enough problem to turn people away from the format. But I think right now, Goat Control and Warrior are a bit more sure bets for actually doing well in these events. Moving on to some other decks, I want to mention Jerry Beans Band because Emissary Beat was actually a deck that won a previous event piloted by LFU2, who I mentioned in the Yata part of this video. But I mean, I don't know if it's the LFU2 difference or this deck is actually good. I'm going to put it in tier 2 for now because it did manage to win, but I'm not sure if we can replicate that progress. LFU2 is just built different. I mean, they are just so good at building very interesting strategies that manage to take the meta by storm and just manage to net him tournament success. I mean, very, very cool stuff from LFU2. Next up, we got Dragons. I think Dragons are rogue. I mean, it's kind of like you just go into King Dragoon and just sit on King Dragoon. And that's fine a lot of the time, but like in a format as aggressive as this, there are other ways to deal with King Dragoon. So I don't know if it's the best thing in the world, but it is something you can play if you want to. So I'm going to put in Rogue. Machine OTK. This could also be just an all-in version of Stein OTK. I think all-in version of Stein OTK, probably tier 2 as well. Just because, again, it can like pop off occasionally, and you are playing Stein stuff, which is individually powerful on its own. You're also playing like Siders everywhere, so like that's also very good. So I'm gonna put it in tier 2. I'll put it above Jerry Beans Band because I'm not sure if Jerry Beans Band was a flash in the pan or not. Next up, Magical Explosion FTK. I mean, I'm gonna put it in trash. Actually, I think it's a lot less consistent than other FTKs have been in the past, and so I'm just gonna put it in trash. If someone wins with it, I'll bump it up to Rogue potentially, or if it becomes much more consistent, I'll bump it up even higher. But right now, I think that this thing is just awful. I think it's really bad. So I'm gonna put it in trash here. Next up, we got Heroes. This is probably also in trash tier. You just don't get enough with Heroes. Miracle Fusion helps a bit, but frankly, the deck is just still not really in a place it needs to be. Although I do really like the build I made for this format. I think it's kind of cool, but I really don't think that the deck can do much better than trash. Next up is Regan Gate Turbo. I think this deck is probably Rogue. It's probably at the top of Rogue. It's kind of like how it does well in GOAT format. Sometimes I think it's a bit worse off here. But it is something that you can still play, and having Cyber Stein in the deck, which a lot of GOAT versions of the deck do have, makes it even more powerful here because Stein can get better things. So there is potential for it, but I think right now it's going to just be in Rogue. Next up, we got Cat OTK. I think actually Cat OTK is a bit slept on in this format. I think it's like top tier 2. I think it is potentially even a better OTK than your Stein OTK, which might be a controversial take, but the Cat OTK deck is just very, very powerful if it gets off its combo, going into multiple Rescue Cats and then multiple like Akugiri Pandas and, you know, Milo's Radiance and things like that. It is just very, very strong, and I think it's pretty good in this format, so I'm going to put it top of tier 2. Next up, we got Burn. Burn, I mean, I'm going to put it top. Do I put it? I'm going to put it here, top of tier 2, relatively. I just think it doesn't really do as well against Goat Control and Warrior, and while it can stop Stein decks, which is kind of nice, given that most people are playing Goat Control and Warrior decks, I think it's not quite above tier 2 just yet. Maybe it goes above Rescue Cat OTK. It probably goes above Rescue Cat OTK, if I'm being honest. But I don't think it's quite there yet. Next up, we have Fire decks. I think this is probably a trash strategy, although top of trash because it can win games here and there. Basically, the idea is you play Spiritual Fire Kurenai and you play an aggressive fire deck and burn out your opponent through that. Kind of cool. Here's one of the new cards from Starter Deck Revolution. But frankly, I just don't think the deck is good enough on its own merits. Next up, we've got Spiritual Water Aoi decks. These are probably also, well, there's more stuff you can do with the hand rip, I think. No, I'm just going to put it in trash here. I'm going to put it probably above the Kurenai decks just because you've got a more powerful rip. But like, frankly, the cards you need to actually support this are pretty bad. Same goes with Kurenai, but like, the low quality cards in both these decks makes it so that they're not in rogue tier, in my opinion. Next up is Chaos Turbo. Chaos Turbo, I think, probably bottom of tier 2. People have not had success with this deck in the format, and maybe it's just people need to try it out more, but it does sort of match up poorly against a bunch of other things here. And to be fair, not many people bring Chaos Turbo to these events because they're playing this to get away from GOAT, kind of. And so, you know, Chaos Turbo is everywhere in GOAT. You don't just want to play it here. But I do think the deck also matches up a bit poorly into like Stein OTK, which is a faster way to kill your opponent. And so Chaos Turbo kind of loses niche there. And so it's probably just tier 2. It could potentially rise in the future, potentially fall in the future, but I think right now I can't put it below tier 2. I can't really put it above tier 2. So it's just going to be in tier 2. That's going to do it for the Cyber format part of this video. I think of the Stein formats, this is one of the ones with the biggest following because it just doesn't really deal with Stein as much as some of the other ones. But it still does have Stein in it, so that is why it is a special type of player in terms of the general tier list. Next up, we got a Reaper format. I'm going to put this below Cyber format in the Takes a Special sort of player because I think that this, again, it's a Stein format, so it does belong in this category, unfortunately. Stein's just such a polarizing card, and frankly, a lot of people do not like it and do not like playing against it. So, unfortunately, it's going to go and take a special sort of player, although back in its heyday, it would have been up here, probably in a higher tier. But right now, the state of the format is pretty dismal, but it's still a fun format to play. I encourage people to try it out. It's just not many people do play it anymore because they felt, I feel like a lot of people feel like they were burned by the promise of Reaper. They came into it expecting like a more balanced version GOAT format, but they got something completely different entirely. So that's why I think this thing is probably in just takes a special sort of player. Okay, for the Reaper tier list, I'm going to start off again by playing Stein Monarch in tier 1. Again, this deck is centralizing the format. It's very, very good. Very, very aggressive, explosive, can just kill you out of nowhere, and probably the most polarizing thing about this format. And that's going to be par for the course for the next couple of formats as well. But I do think there are some other decks that are better than it, just like in Cyber format. I think, personally, Bazoo Return is better than Stein Monarch. Bazoo Return is my favorite deck in the format in terms of just a competitive deck that I'd want to play. Bazoo Return is very powerful and can do some very just broken things. And so I do like it a lot. I think it's very flexible as well. So I'm going to put it above Stein Monarch. I also think that Warriors are above Stein Monarch, personally. The deck is just very flexible, very aggressive, and can easily get the opponent down below the 5,000 life point threshold they need for Stein. So I think that that is sort of a necessary feature of a deck to actually place above Stein Monarch. And I think that Warriors do that. So I'm going to put it above Monarch. It could probably even go above Bazoo Return, but it just depends on what you think is better. I personally think Bazoo Return is slightly better, but that's just my own personal opinion on it. Although I will say I didn't think there's one other tier 1 deck, and that is Stallburn. That is not going to be pleasant for many people to hear, but Stallburn has been doing well in past events, and I could see it just continuing to do well in the future. This is definitely one of those decks that could definitely drop down. Because Stallburn really thrives in metagames that are not prepared for it, and also against players that don't really know how to play against it. And so if players get more adept at the matchup and the metagame is more prepared for it, it could definitely fall down some tiers here. But I think for now, it is definitely a tier 1 deck. But moving on to some of the other decks in the format, Dark World, I'm going to put in Rogue or Trash. I'm going to put in Trash. I just think the deck does not do enough in this format. I know that a lot of people are going to be upset to hear that, but I do think it's just not really that good. Maybe if you play it with DDV, maybe that's going to be a version of the deck that will be a bit better, because Deck Devastation Virus has devastated a fair amount of formats after it's sort of been experimented with more and discovered, so it could definitely rise in the future. But I think for now, it is just trash here, unfortunately. Next up is Chaos. I think Chaos is tier 2. I think it's very good, don't get me wrong. It just hadn't really done enough in past events to really raise higher right now at this point in the format. I also think that there are other things that can stop it, like Kike the Ghost Sword is a great side deck card against it that also stops Bazoo Return a bit. So I do think that there are counters to this that are getting played against better decks in the format, and this just is a bit too slow in this format, I think. Still a very good deck, though, so good to keep in mind that just because it's in tier 2 does not mean that I don't think it can win an event or that it's bad. It's just in tier 2 because it's just not quite there at the level to compete with the 4 best decks right now, in my opinion. Next up, we've got sort of just FTK or alt win-con decks, exemplified by Exchange the Spirit here. I don't think these decks are really that good. They're very, very hard to pull off, and they're not fast enough to compete with some of the more aggressive decks in the format. So I'm going to put them in trash here under the Dark World deck. Next up is Windbeat. I'm going to put Windbeat, maybe controversial opinion. Now I'm going to put in Rogue. I have talked with Windbeat in the past in some big Reaper tournaments, but that being said, I think the deck just doesn't quite do enough to compete with the big boys here. And like while Spiritual Wind Dart Miyabi is very good, it spins a thing back to the bottom of the deck. And also you can play this as basically as a last will toolbox because there's so many good win things that trigger last will. I do think that the deck is not quite at the level where it rises to tier 2. Next up is Freed / Light Banish. I think that honestly, this deck has had success in the past and still is very good, but I think it might be Rogue. I don't think it's really done much after the first event that it won. And I think that it's very cool, don't get me wrong, but like, I'm not really sure it's able to compete on tier 2 anymore. Next up is Tomato Control. This is a deck, it could go tier 2. It's just very, very slow. It's one of the slowest decks in the format, but it is very competitive. It is a very controlling deck. And it eats through your opponent's resources over time and then chips them down. But again, with Stein decks in the format, that might not be necessarily good enough. I'm going to put it bottom of tier 2, I'm going to say, right now. It could definitely rise in the future. It could definitely fall in the future. But for now, I'm going to put it at bottom of tier 2. That's where I feel like it probably belongs. Next up, we got Rescue Cat OTK. I'm going to put this actually at the top of tier 2. I think this deck is potentially a better OTK than Stein OTK, just like in Cyber format. And it is just a brutal deck. It sort of combines Stall and also Stein OTK into a very powerful deck on its own. It can definitely rise in the future. But I think right now it is just top of tier 2. Not quite at the level of tier 1 just yet. Dead Rat is next, and this breaks my heart. But Dead Rat is probably going to go at top of Rogue. Dead Rat is just a deck that was really hyped when it was discovered, but unfortunately it has not been able to do enough to actually compete in the metagame. Unfortunately, it's just there are better things you can be doing. And Dead Rat, while it's cool, just did not do enough on its own. And of course, there are different versions of Dead Rat you can build. People have really tried to break this deck beyond its current capabilities, but unfortunately, it has not really managed to make that much of a dent on the competitive metagaming, at least. So that's why it is in Rogue right now. Strike Ninja. I'm going to put this is kind of a deck that also uses Tomato and can be explosive. I'm going to put it in at tier 2. I think it's a bit worse than Chaos Return, but it can sort of set up the same style of plays that Bazoo Return and Chaos can. So I'm going to put it in tier 2. I think it's fine. It's a good deck. It can potentially do okay at tournaments, but it isn't tier 1 just yet, and it's not quite as good as the other tier 2 decks in my opinion. It could easily drop down to Rogue though, but I do think it does have some gas in it. Next up is Uriah. Unfortunately, it's funny, but it is in trash in my opinion. There aren't enough good continuous traps to pair with it. It just doesn't do enough on its own. So that's going to be my tier list for Reaper format. As you can see, it's a pretty diverse format overall, even though Stein does centralize it. But again, Stein centralizing it does make it so that like it does take a special sort of player because even if there are tons of cool decks in the format, if one of those decks that sees a lot of play is a deck that just makes a lot of non-games, it can be very unfortunate to play against. But I do think the format is still fun for that special type of player who can sit through the Stein combos every once in a while. And if you can do that, then this is a great format for you. Next up, we've got Chaos Return format based around SJC Indianapolis in 2006. So a year after the GOAT format SJC Indianapolis. And again, takes a special sort of player. I'm going to put it... Do I put it above Cyber or below Cyber? I think I'm going to put it below Cyber because Cyber at least feels at its bones kind of similar to GOAT format, which can draw more people in. And Chaos Return is sort of like, I would say it's sort of the best of the Stein era formats that feel like a Stein era format, right? Like I'd say Cyber doesn't really feel like as Steiny as some of the others. But Chaos Return definitely feels very Steiny. But it's still fun. It is a fun time if you can stomach the Stein stuff. But I do think that it does take a special sort of player to play. And it's just kind of unfortunate about it. But it is how it goes sometimes. And we got one more Stein format after that. And then we'll get into some actually interesting formats to talk about again. But Chaos Return is still interesting in its own right, as hopefully the tier list will help you sort of show you. Now, of course, Stein decks are very centralizing. I'm going to put that in tier 1 right away. Whether it be Stein Monarch or Stein Pure. It's just a very good deck in the format, and Graceful Charity's in the format now, so that makes it more consistent for a lot of decks to play with. But again, I'm not sure if Stein Monarch is the best deck in the format. It did win the last Chaos Return event that happened. So, I think I am going to put it at the top of this list here. But I do think there are other decks that can really give it a run for its money, like Dark World Burn, that won a previous event, and it's a very cool deck. Basically, Graceful Charity in the format, so you can pitch these Dark Worlds, bring them back pretty easily. You can also play Direct Devastation Virus if you want to. That can potentially stop Stein. It's just a very, very cool deck that plays very aggressively and can just get Stein below that 5,000 life point threshold it needs to activate his stuff, and can potentially win the game from there. So I think Dark World Burn is actually really good in this format. While it was trash in Reaper, the existence of Graceful Charity just changes so much. And so I do think it is tier 1 here. But there are some other good decks here. Like, I would say probably Monarch probably does belong in tier 1. I think it's pretty good. Whether you play Stein or not, you can play the pure version, and the pure version is also going to be pretty decent here. But moving on, we've got some other decks. Lightbeat actually did pretty decently at the last Chaos Return format event, so I'm going to put that in tier 2. It's a deck that's just getting a bunch of Lights Engraved, playing with Free, doing things like that, so that can be kind of neat overall. But I think it probably is just still a tier 2 deck. Apprentice Monarch is a deck that's in the format now. You can creature swap and pull off the combo with Apprentice. That's probably also tier 2. I'll put it below Lightbeat, though, because Lightbeat recently got second. Again, I don't put too much stock in these results because they're very, very small events. But if I need a tiebreaker like that, I can use the results of the events just to tiebreak for me. Counter Fairies, unfortunately, is trash. I love Counter Fairies as a deck. It's just not there at the moment. There just aren't enough good counter traps to pair with the Bountiful Artemises. And the Bountiful Artemises are unsearchable, really, in this format. So it's kind of tough to make work, but it's still fun to tinker with. Next up, we got Chaos. I mean, Chaos, it's named Chaos Return for a reason. I think this deck is probably tier 1. I'd put it near the bottom tier 1 just because it hadn't been doing as much as some of the others, but Chaos is still a strong deck in the format. Banishing your opponent's stuff is good. Just playing a more methodical game plan is still very good as well. So I think that this deck is still pretty good. I'm actually going to put it above Pure Monarchs. I think Pure Monarchs are not as good as Pure Chaos. So I'm going to put Chaos a little bit above Monarchs there. Next up, we got DDT. DDT, I'm going to put it in trash. I don't think there's enough with DDT right now. The main thing you're going for with DDT here is desk croaking plays, and that is really bad. So I think it's more competent than Counter Fairies, but it's still pretty bad overall. Next up, we've got sort of Macro Monarch. Macro Monarch, it is an anti-meta deck. It does hit some of the top decks in the bracket, so I'm going to put it in tier 2. But I'm not really sure if it goes above that. There are just ways to deal with the deck. And once it's dealt with, then it's not really the best thing in the world. But I do think that the deck is fine enough to be in tier 2 for sure. Maybe even above Apprentice Monarch. I'm going to put it top of tier 2 just because it is sort of an anti-meta pick. And it does also hose Lightbeat and Apprentice Monarch. Actually, it doesn't really hose Apprentice Monarch because Apprentice still gets the effect even if it's banished. But it does still hurt the deck a little bit. Next up, we got Heroes. I'm going to put this, I don't know. It didn't really have too much to its name. It can do some interesting stuff. But I think overall, it's probably, I mean, if you're playing the Miracle version of Heroes, it's probably trash here. I don't really think it does enough, and Hero Fusions are not really good enough to really justify playing it. So I'm going to put it in trash here for now, although it is a fun deck. For sure. And there are other ways you can play it. Like Wildheart Control is actually pretty good. I'd put Wildheart Control either in Rogue or tier 2, although I'd more classify that as Warriors. So I'd say Warriors probably belong in tier 2. But I'll put Heroes and Rogue to split the difference at least. So you've got different ways to play it. But it's still a fun deck to play for sure. Next up, we got Zombies. Zombies, just like the Dead Rat. It's just not really that good in this format. I think I'm going to put it in Rogue above Heroes here. So I'll just put it there. Chaos Return itself, in addition to Chaos Pure, you can play the return stuff. I'm going to put Chaos Return at top of tier 2. That's actually the real namesake of the format, but I think Chaos Control is potentially better than Chaos Return. That might be my hot take, but if you're playing a deck that wants to just spit a bunch of monsters out on the board, then you've got better options for that. Like Dark World, I think is a better option for that. So I'm going to put Chaos Return in tier 2. It can definitely rise. Everything here is definitely very flexible and subject to change over time. There are going to be more regular formats or regular tournaments, that is, in Chaos Return in the future. So this could definitely shift over time even further. But right now, this is sort of where I fall. And FTK nonsense, that's going to go in trash, probably above Counter Fairy, but it's not really that good in this format. Again, the format's just too aggressive, so it just does go in trash here, unfortunately. Finally, we've reached the end of the Stein formats with Stein format itself. This is a format that I'm going to put at the bottom of the Stein formats here and takes a special sort of player. Again, if you enjoy this sort of thing, you can play it. But I do think it is sort of the worst that Stein gets. It's right before the ban of Stein, the emergency ban of Stein, may I add. And for good reason. I actually could put this in unplayable. Actually might put this in unplayable. Yeah, I'm going to put it in unplayable. Yeah, might as well fill out this tier list a little bit more down there. But this format's just like not really good. I mean, there's Stein running around everywhere. It's not like necessarily tier 0 Stein, but it's pretty close to it. And there are other decks that you can play, like Chainburn to counter Stein a bit as well. But like, frankly, the deck is very, very centralized around Stein. Like everything in the format is much more centralized around Stein compared to any of the previous ones. And yeah, largely because Ring of Destruction's out. Ring of Destruction changes a lot now in Stein format. They brought it back for some reason, and it really does make Stein just that much better because you have so many more options to OTK with it that it's, I mean, I think Stein format's kind of in the unplayable category, but that's just me. Some people do enjoy it, and let's dive into the tier list for the people who do enjoy it, just to talk about what the best decks in the room are in that format. Okay, well, I got to put Stein at the top of tier 1. This could be the pure version of Stein, and then we got Stein Monarch as well. I don't know whether pure Stein or Stein Monarch is up top, but definitely one of them I think is probably at the top of the format. It's just so powerful. Of course, Warriors is also a very good deck in the format, and it actually has 1 event in the format. So I think in my last tier list, I put Warrior ahead of these two. But I think Stein is so just degenerate here and so powerful that it really can just take out Warriors completely. Now, Warriors has a nice thing with like Wildheart getting around, Ring of Destruction, things like that. So it does have some merit in the format. But I think overall, it's just like, I mean, the format's Stein format for a reason. So I'm going to put Stein above the Warrior deck. Again, with further testing, maybe this will shift even further. Maybe I will say, like, actually, Warrior the best deck in the room. But I think right now, this is where I sort of fall. Next up, I want to talk about Dark World Burn. Dark World Burn, while it is tier 1 in Chaos Return format, I think it has gotten a little bit worse in this format. I mean, Ring of Destruction is very nice for a burn deck, right? Because it's very good there. But it's just, the Stein decks are much better with the Ring. Like, Stein decks can take advantage of Ring more than other decks can, in my opinion, because it just gives them more and more ways to kill the opponent. So I'm going to put Dark World Burn in tier 2, along with Chainburn, actually. Chainburn, I think, is not really that good in this format. Yes, you have 3 Chain Strikes, so that helps a bit. But I think Chainburn is just not really the best. It did get 3rd at the last Stein format event that was held. But, like, I don't really think that's necessarily a function of the deck being good enough to potentially win an event. I think that's just a function of it being a small tournament and variance being a factor. But it could also fall down to Rogue or below. I just don't think it will rise up to tier 1. But, you know, potentially if you're looking at it as a counter to Stein decks, it is potentially a hard anti-meta pick. But then also loses to decks like Warrior, right? So I think it's just tier 2, maybe top of tier 2, but I do like Dark World Burn a little bit better. So I'm going to put Dark World Burn a little bit above this one. And when I say like a little bit better, I don't mean that I like the deck personally. Like, I do like the deck personally better than Chain Strike, but what I mean by that is, I mean, I think Dark World Burn's a little bit better than Chain Strike Burn. Anyways, we got a Prince Monarch. I think Prince Monarch's fine. I'm going to put it at the bottom of tier 2. I mean, it's something you can play. I think it's a worse Monarch deck than Stein Monarch, but it is something, and it does get around Ring of Destruction, I guess, a little bit. So I don't know. It's not really the best in my opinion, though. Next up, we got Hero and FTK. I mean, both these, I think, just belong in trash here. They're not really that good, but you can play them if you want to. It's just they're not really the most manageable decks in the world. Now, there are some other decks you can play in this format, which we'll see a lot on the Chimeratech format tier list, which we'll be covering soon. But I think these are the ones that, you know, are most, you know, notable for you to encounter. And so that's why I focused on these instead of going into all the different sort of sub decks you could play in the format. Now, the reason why there are so many decks that Chimeratech and Stein format share is because Chimeratech format is basically Stein format, but just with Stein banned. You know, there are some new cards that are released, namely the gadgets. Those are very important. But on the whole, it's basically just, they were like, nope, let's just get rid of Stein, and the format should be good beyond that. And lo and behold, they were correct. Chimeratech format actually, in my opinion, is peak Yu-Gi-Oh! I think whether it's above Yata or after Yata depends on whether you like GX or DM a little bit better. But Chimeratech format is, to me, the perfect GX era format. It feels like a GX era format should. It's centralized around GX anime like boss, right? But it is a very diverse format as well. Like Machine OTK is a very powerful deck, but it's not the only deck in the room. And, people are discovering more decks all the time. And it really feels almost like what Reaper was promised to be, where it's a diverse GX era format that people can really dive into and find a lot to love there. Now, Machine OTK is a deck in the format, and not everyone likes OTKs, but compared to Stein OTK, there are so many ways to stop Machine OTK that, it's not really a big problem, in my opinion. So I'm going to put Chimeratech in PQEO. I hope more people give this format a shot because I do think it is probably the best GX era format that I've fully covered on the channel so far. Getting into the tiers, we've got a lot of different decks here, and this can definitely change over time because more decks are being discovered all the time. But to start with, let's start with the winner of the last event. We got Gadgets. Gadgets did win the last Chimeratech format event, and the deck is pretty good. I mean, you just go for Gadgets. You use removal 1-for-1 on your opponent's stuff, and you're just able to make it to the finish line that way. And that's pretty strong. So this deck could definitely fall in the future if people bring in more side deck tech cards for it. Like King Terror Wangu, for instance. If that starts being played more, then that is definitely a major hurdle for Gadgets to overcome. But I do think Gadgets are still very good and definitely deserve a tier 1 status right now. Bazoo Return actually I think is pretty decent in this format. I think it's tier 1 potentially. I'm gonna put it in tier 1. Maybe drop it down to tier 2. It hasn't really done too much. I like it enough to put in tier 1. It's tough to get a lot of the decks in the format, like because the format's so underexplored. They've not been played too often. There haven't been too many events, and so it's tough to really say which ones are tier 1 and tier 2. I know I said that you shouldn't really put too much stock in the events and those results personally, because like they're very small events, and I'm trying not to do that here. But the events can give you like at least guideposts to like what decks might be good and what decks you should maybe consider. And Bazoo, I'm willing to put in tier 1 based on my own testing, but it hadn't really done too much in events. So I'm going to put it in tier 1, but probably near the bottom of tier 1 there. Machine OTK definitely deserves to be in tier 1. Very powerful deck. It's the namesake of the format, and while it isn't as busted as it was at the original event, and while builds have definitely changed since the original build that won that event, I do think it's still very good, and so I'm going to put it in tier 1. And along similar lines, I think Dragons is sort of Machine OTK, but with worse monsters in the main deck, but it does have some advantage over Machine OTK. For instance, you don't need to see Cyber Dragon to actually go into Chimeratech. It just takes any 5 dragons, and you can get those in the graveyard pretty quickly. Also, 5-headed Dragon does not blow itself up when it's brought out off of Future Fusion. So that is another nice benefit there. Of course, you can get around the Future Fusion Chimeratech blowing itself up with Cyber Phoenix. That is a way to get around that. But like, 5-headed Dragon is a bit more of a flexible boss monster. But Chimeratech OTK does have the benefit of just killing the opponent outright. And just playing a higher quality of main deck monsters. So I'm going to put Machine OTK in the tier 1 slot, but I do think that Dragon OTK, I think it could potentially rise up in the future. I mean, maybe people would probably call it Rogue. I'm willing to call it tier 2. I'm willing to go out on a limb and call it tier 2, although it could definitely fall to Rogue in the future. But I think it is a slept-on deck in the format for sure. Next we got Aliens. Aliens, I'm just going to put in trash. Listen, I find Aliens really fun. It's got some neat things that it can do. Brainwashing Beam is kind of nuts if you're able to set it up, but the key part is able to set it up, and getting A counters on your opponent's things are easier said than done. Alien Gray is pretty good because it's basically Decoichi that puts a counter on your opponent's thing, but it is hard to pull off because it has to be destroyed by battle, and that's not always going to happen. So I'm going to put it in trash tier for now. Maybe people experiment with a further rise up to Rogue, but right now it's just not above trash, in my opinion. Chainburn only has one. Oh, I don't know. Chainburn, it could potentially be. I'm going to put it in Rogue. It's just pretty bad. You don't need to get people below the 5,000 life point threshold in this format, so like decks don't really care as much about burn decks like this. So I'm putting in Rogue. I don't really think it's that good. Yeah, Cyberdark, I'm gonna put in trash here. I know it has its fans, but it just feels like a worse version of Machine OTK and Dragons put together, and so I'm just gonna put it in trash here because of that. Dark World, I think, could be tier 2. You still do have Graceful Charity, so that is something here. But I do think that it's just a bit of a slower deck here. And again, you don't need to get the opponent down below the 5,000 life point threshold. You can play a bit more of a methodical game. And Dark Worlds kind of needs to be in a format that is more aggressive to actually have its place. Next up is Neos Turbo. Neos Turbo, I think, is Rogue. Just bring back Neos multiple times with E Oversoul. Oversoul, E Emergency Call. But either way, that's pretty good. 2,500 body is pretty decent. So I'm going to put it in Rogue. Warriors, probably tier 1. And Monarch also probably tier 1. I don't generally like having 5 things in tier 1, but I think generally a function of the format being underexplored, maybe either above Bazoo Return. Maybe Bazoo Return should go in tier 2 just to make it 4 things in tier 1. But it's really tough to say what the tier 1 decks are. I think there are a lot of powerful decks vying for that spot, and a lot of these decks make it here because they're just generally good in the GX era, right? Like Warriors are generally good, Monarchs are generally good, Bazoo Return's generally good. And I think they have done well in tournaments in the past and events in the past. It's just like a matter of, can they still do well? With further optimization, will they do better than some of the other decks here? I don't know. It's unclear. We'll have to keep watching and finding out. But either way, Chimeratech format is a really fun format. I really hope it does get a bit more of a following in 2025. I think it's a format that could really grow even further. It can be viewed as like the Edison of the GX era. I think that will get a lot of people involved in it because I do think it is a really, really fun format that everyone should try out. Next up, we've got a format that I'm not going to do a tier list for because frankly, we just do not have the data on it. And also the tier list would be kind of boring. And that is Airblade format. Now, Airblade format is a format that is sort of a historical curiosity for Yu-Gi-Oh! Where like it was a tier 0 format. And I mean, tier 0 at the time, maybe in further testing, it won't be tier 0. And, you know, there are some interesting results for that, where we do have a recent Airblade locals that we held on the YFZ from Zero Discord server, linked in the description down below, that Airblade did not win at. So maybe Airblade is not the best deck in the format. That is possible. But the deck is very, very strong. Basically, it's a Reason Gate Turbo style deck that is using Element Hero Stratos and Phoenix Blade Gearfried to just set up some crazy, crazy plays. And the deck is just super, super powerful. And it is very degenerate. So the thing is that Airblade itself is kind of a fun deck. So if you like playing Airblade, you'll like the format. So that is potentially a special type of player thing, but that's like the same thing as saying if you like Science FTK, you'll like playing the format. I'm going to put it in unplayable, but I'm going to put it at the top of unplayable. Because I enjoy playing Airblade. I have fun just diving into it and sometimes doing some crazy combos. And again, you know, this could change in the future. With the Airblade event that we had on the YG from Zero Discord server, Airblade did not win. Airblade made it to finals, but it did not win. And there were a fair amount of people playing Airblade. So maybe the deck is not actually as hyped up as it, you know, is hyped up to be, I guess. But I personally think that Airblade is still the best deck in the format. If I did do a tier list, I would still have Airblade as tier 0. Because I do think that the deck is just so flexible, can do so much. And it plays on a completely different axis than like any other deck in like a long period of Yu-Gi-Oh's history. Like it's basically a modern deck in the GX era. So I think the deck is extremely strong. And so I'm going to put it in the tier 0 format in unplayable because it can be very miserable to just sit there and watch your opponent combo off through their Airblade stuff and then just win the game off that. But next up, we've got Demise format. Demise format's the format held in SJC Anaheim 2007. This is a format that was won by Demise OTK, which is why it's called Demise. And very, very similar to Trooper format. The only reason why this is different from Trooper format is because there was a different ban list there. So, you know, I personally find Demise format to be very fun. But I find Trooper format and Demise format to fall into similar traps where, like, they are very aggressive formats and somewhat sacky formats as well. I think the decks are very cool. I think it does capture a feeling of the GX era, but also now Crush Card Virus is legal, which not everyone's going to enjoy. So I'm going to put it in enjoyable. I'm going to put it in enjoyable below Chaos because I think Chaos is more iconic. But I do think that it does belong in enjoyable for now. Maybe in the future, this will change as more events happen. But I think right now it's just sort of a solidly enjoyable format. Still pretty fun, but not quite to the level of a great time or peak Yu-Gi-Oh for me yet. Diving into the tier list, I sort of consolidated down to 8 decks here. And part of that's because like some of them have a lot of different variations, like Monarchs. You could have a sort of proto perfect circle Monarch without Ryza. You could have Apprentice Monarch. You could have Macro Monarch, and those decks all play somewhat differently. But I think at the end of the day, if we take Monarchs at its best, I think it is a tier 1 deck in the format. Monarchs is very, very strong. It's definitely worse than it will be in some of the following formats once you get Ryza. For instance, in Trooper format, I think Monarch is probably the best deck in the format. But I think here it's not the best deck in the format. I think it's still very good, but it's only tier 1. It doesn't quite compete with some of the other decks that are running around, but it is still very good. I will say that speaking of Trooper format, we do also have Trooper decks in the format. We have the Troop Dupe Scoop combo where they summon out a card Trooper, you know, go for machine duplication, get out 2 more card Troopers, and win the game from that. I think Troop Dupe Scoop is maybe better than Monarch. I don't think it's better in this format than it is in Trooper format, ironically, because Monarch does not have Ryza, which makes Monarch better. But I'm going to put it maybe at top of tier 1. So it's kind of tricky because I will say that the the tournament that we had for this, was definitely very unexpected, because these two decks, while they did make it to the top cut, they didn't necessarily do as well as many people expected them to do, because Six Samurai actually won the entire event. So I could put Six Sam here. However, Six Sam is like a very sort of high variance deck, right? Like if you draw well with Six Sam, or you get good reasoning calls with Six Sam, it can easily be tier 1 and just win against any deck in the format. But I think this is one of those cases where, like, this is a small event at the end of the day, and Six Sam has too much variance for me to put it in tier 1. I think that it's not as consistent as the other decks here, so I am going to put it in tier 2. This could rise in the future. Six Sam, after all, has consistently placed in top cut in all the tournaments that we've had performance around this era. So that is a good sign for Six Sam to potentially be up in the tier 1 category where it belongs. But I do think that right now it's tier 2. I'm going to be very cautious with this. I don't want to make any like crazy claims about Six Sams here. So I am going to put them in tier 2, even though it did win an event here. But moving on, we've got Dark World. Dark World, it's not as good here. You don't have Graceful Charity anymore. So the deck is unfortunately not really as good. I'm not necessarily going to put it in trash, because you do have new tools now from Strike of Neos to pair with it. You've got Dark World Dealings, which is very good. You can turn it into sort of like a Virus Turbo deck. So that's also kind of nice. I'm going to put it in Rogue, though, because frankly, like, the viruses only get you so far. And so yeah, I'm going to put it in Rogue. Next up, we get Demise ODK. And, if you'd asked me before we had the event that we held, I would put this in Rogue, just saying like, well, it won the event that, the format's named after, but, with modern innovations, like more people playing Trap Dust Shoot and just other things that you can use to stop Demise ODK, there are just better things you could be doing. But I'm actually going to put it in tier 2. And the reason for that is it actually did put up decent results at the event that we held. And again, I don't try and put too much stock in these results here, but I also think it's good not to entirely ignore the results as well. And the fact that multiple people managed to reach top cut on Demise ODK means that maybe the deck is better than we're giving it credit for. And so I am going to cautiously put it in tier 2. Probably not near the top of tier 2, but I am going to put it in tier 2 because I don't want to just, casually dismiss it as like, oh, well, it's just variance. Because multiple people did top with this thing. So I do think that it's probably tier 2. And when it does pull off the combo, it is really, really good. It's just, pulling off the combo can be a bit tough. Next up, we get Diamond Dude Turbo. I'm going to put Diamond Dude Turbo in Rogue. Maybe it's better than Rogue because you do have triple Magical Stone activation here. That's the reason kind of to play Demise format, because it uses the list that has triple Magical Stone activation compared to Trooper format. But I do think that it might not do enough to really make this deck good enough to compete with the others. And, Airblade was sort of the deck's peak. Here, it's just kind of like, it's fine. It's just, I don't think it's consistent enough to make it to tier 2 or tier 1. So I'm going to put it in Rogue for now. But that could definitely change in the future. Maybe this will rise up as more people try out the deck, try out the triple Magical Stone activation. I think right now, though, it's not quite at that level. Next up, we get Gadgets. I think Gadgets are a solid either tier 1 or upper tier 2. I'm going to put them, I put Six Sams in tier 2. I'm going to put Gadgets in tier 2. They just didn't really do enough in this event, and also, pulling the rug is legal in the format, which really does hose the deck a bit. So I'm actually going to put it at the bottom of tier 2. Well, I'll put it above Demise, but I'm going to put it below Six Sams. I feel like Six Sams definitely had more potential to go into tier 1 than Gadgets do. And lastly, we've got Metamorphosis, which represents T-Hero here, which is a very cool hero deck, which tries to basically, use Metamorphosis to go into like Ryu Sentry off of like Destiny Hero Malicious and things like that. Very flexible deck, very cool deck. I think unfortunately with testing, it is not held up as well as it did at the time. So I'm going to put it in tier 2. I'm going to put it below Gadgets, in fact. Actually, I'm going to put it below the Demise, because Demise held up better than T-Hero, I think, did. I think that T-Hero could definitely rise up in the future or fall in the future. I think the deck is still very good. It is a bit bricky in awkward ways, and so I don't think it's quite as consistent as some of the other things in Tier 1 or upper Tier 2. And again, format's still very underexplored. If I'm going based on results, then 6M should definitely be in Tier 1. Gadgets could also potentially be in Tier 1, but pulling the rug really does hose them a bit. I mean, there's definitely a lot of different things here that you can pull from. The main thing I was pulling from is from Trooper format, because it is very, very similar to Trooper format. So I'm like, well, the Tier 1 decks in Trooper format, I'm pretty confident that Trooper and Monarch are still very good. And I think they are still probably in Tier 1, but I'm less confident in everything else here. And so that's why I'm being cautious and putting them in Tier 2. You know what? Actually, I'll make a controversial statement. I'll put 6M in Tier 1. I'll put 6M tier 1. Let's see how it stands up in the course of time. This is the 2025 tier list. Over the course of 2025 beyond, maybe the 6M deck will fall in the rankings even further. But I think right now, I'm going to put in tier 1 just to even out the graph a little bit. And I think it was on the borderline there anyways, and so I'm going to take a chance on it. So we'll see how this tier list holds up in the future for this format, but I do think that, this is pretty good for the amount of diversity that the format does have, and just the amount of room for exploration, because I think there are a lot more things that people can explore, given that Perfect Circle Monarch is not sort of the dominant deck in the room in this format. Next up, we've got Trooper format, and Trooper format, this might be a hot take, but I'm going to put it right under Demise and Enjoyable. It might be a hot take because I feel like a lot of people like Trooper more than Demise, but I feel like personally, Demise format has more diversity than Trooper format, and diversity isn't always a good thing, right? But I feel like the deck introduced in the Perfect Circle format, or not Perfect Circle format, but Trooper format, namely Perfect Circle Monarch, is very, very strong. And so it's just kind of like a very centralized deck in whatever formats it's round in. And it feels like just upon revisitation for a lot of these formats, Perfect Circle Monarch, wherever it is, just becomes the best deck in the room. And so I feel like Trooper format, with more exploration, it's likely that Perfect Circle Monarch will just take the cake as the best deck there. So I feel like it's less enjoyable to me than Demise, but I still think it is enjoyable. It's still fun. So I'm going to put it in the enjoyable tier. Okay, the Trooper format tier list is going to be very similar to Demise. The formats are very similar. There's just minor new cards added and minor change to the ban list. Of course, the new card added that is most impactful is Ride the Storm Monarch. It makes Perfect Circle Monarch that much better. And I do think that this is the best deck in the format right now. Trooper, of course, is fine. Troop Dupe Scoop, like that strategy is still fine. It's still tier 1 in my opinion. But it's sort of like, I think these are the two best decks in the room. Nothing else has really like super convinced me that they're on this level compared to these two. But there are a fair amount of tier 2 decks that can also do well. I think Baboon Burn is a good new inclusion. I think it's probably tier 2, pretty strong. And again, Burn is tough for people to play against, so I think it could do well in the future. I think 6 Sams is also good. Didn't win the event for Trooper format, but it did top, so that is pretty good. I think that Gadget is probably still tier 2. I think the deck is pretty strong, even with pulling the rug. I think it's pretty decent. I do think that, though, there are some other difficulties to playing other decks into Perfect Circle Monarch. I think Perfect Circle Monarch spinning back your stuff to top of deck is really annoying for certain decks to deal with. So I do think that does lower the power level of a lot of other things. I think the Dark World's acting as Virus Turbo is still fine. The viruses are basically chainable if you've got a Dark World on field, and if they target your monster, then, they don't get to spin it back. So I think the viruses are fine. Crystal Beast is a new deck in this format. It is not good. It is trashed here, but it is something that you can play. I will mention, like, for Monarchs, I just sort of put every Monarch deck in a box and put it at the top of tier 1, but there is also Volcanic Monarch. Volcanic's with the other archetype introduced in Force of the Breaker. And Volcanic Monarchs, if you played that version of the deck, probably tier 2. But, like, I do think that it's just Monarchs is just Perfect Circle Monarch in this format. That is the best deck you can play if you want to play that style of deck. So I didn't really include it in the tier list here. I think Demise is also kind of rogue now. Although, again, maybe it's just something that we need to revisit because in Demise format it did better than expected. But I do think that Perfect Circle Monarch is tough. Although, then again, if they spin back like your Manju or something, like you get another search of something. So that's something that they don't necessarily want to spin back. So maybe Demise, I'm going to put it in tier 2. I'm going to be optimistic for it. I'm going to say maybe it can do stuff here based on how it did in Trooper, but I don't have the highest hopes for Demise. It's just something that maybe it can. And again, we're not basing this only on results. We're basing it off of opinions as well. And my opinion is that Demise probably needs a little bit more testing in Trooper format here. DDT, I think it's just still in Rogue. I think it's just not really good. I'm going to put below Dark World because I feel like DDT is in a worse spot. If they summon out Ryza, spin back the Diamond Dude, then that's pretty bad for you. So it's not the worst thing in the world, but it's still like not necessarily what you want to be drawing. So I'm going to put it in Rogue. And then I think the T-Hero stuff, I think this actually does fall to Rogue. I'm going to put it above Dark World. But like, I do think that this deck, like for instance, Ryza does deal with Ryu Sentry, right? Like there are plenty of things that deal with what this deck brings out. So I'm going to put it in Rogue now. Yeah, but I do think that this is a pretty good tier list. I mean, I think the Trooper is still very fun. I think it's not as centralized as something like Perfect Circle Monarch does yet. I think that it can potentially be as centralized as that in the future, just centralizing around the deck that Perfect Circle format got its name from. But I do think that, in the meantime, there's still a lot of room for exploration. I could definitely be proven wrong about that. So I'm going to sort of lock in this tier list at the start of 2025, but I definitely expect this to change over time. Lastly, we get to the end of the tier list with two formats that I'm kind of sort of grouped together. I mean, honestly, I probably shouldn't have even covered zombie format as just a format on its own, because it really should be perfect circle format. But zombie format, I'm going to place, and this is kind of weird. This is part of why I shouldn't have covered zombie format. Zombie format, for those who don't know, is based around SC Durham in October of 2007. And it's basically the same thing as perfect circle monarch format, except like it doesn't have gladiator assaults. And that's pretty much it. It was dominated by zombies at the time, but in hindsight testing, people found out the perfect circle monarch is just kind of the best deck in the room. Which is not a bad thing. It still is enjoyable to have those perfect circle mirror matches, although it's not quite to the same level as perfect circle monarch in perfect circle. And so for that reason, this is tricky. This is tricky because I kind of want to put it in takes a special sort of player, because it does kind of take a special sort of player to play zombie, since perfect circle format is just kind of like the better format overall. I'm gonna put perfect circle monarch, or perfect circle format, but it is perfect circle monarch format. But I'm gonna put it in great time, because I've been really enjoying it so far. I've only played a bit of it, so it could definitely rise to peak Yu-Gi-Oh! In the future, but I can't quite put it there yet, okay? I know that people are screaming the stream saying, put it in peak Yu-Gi-Oh! I will say, I will be doing a sort of tier list of all the GX formats specifically after I cover the GX era, and at that point, it probably will rise up to peak Yu-Gi-Oh! But for now, since I just started, I can't put it in peak Yu-Gi-Oh! Yet, okay? I gotta reserve those for the formats that I'm sure on, and for Perfect Circle, all I'm sure of now is that I'm having a blast in it, so it's a great time. But zombie format, it's like, if you want to play that instead of Perfect Circle, like, I think it is a special sort of player, because most people would just prefer Perfect Circle to zombie. So, weird case, but I'm going to put it in and take a special sort of player. Realistically, this is an enjoyable format, so it should be an enjoyable, but I'm putting it here to make a point. So, in the future, I'm not really going to be sort of differentiating between formats as much with that. I'm probably just going to split it by ban list. And Perfect Circle Monarch format and zombie format have the same ban list, so, like, and they're very similar. So, like, I'm not really going to split it up further like that in the future, unless there really is a reason to split it up beyond just ban lists. But that's going to do it for this section of the video here. I will be doing a tier list for the decks on zombie format, but I'm not going to do it for Perfect Circle yet, because I just started exploring Perfect Circle format. So I don't really have an opinion on what the tier list for Perfect Circle looks like yet, but I do have a pretty strong opinion for what the zombie format tier list looks like. So to start off with the tier list here, Monarch, top of tier 1, best deck in the room. Now, there are different decks that you can play in the Monarch umbrella. For instance, the last event that was held in zombie format actually wasn't necessarily Perfect Circle as many people view it, but it was sort of a rat Monarch list, where it was playing like Giant Rat to go into Earth targets and, just be a recruiter and just, playing off that. So that is a way you can play it. Also, Volcanic Monarch is a deck you can play. Like, beyond just Perfect Circle Monarch, there are other Monarch decks you can play. But either way, those Monarch decks are tier 1, because Ryza is just such a house. Ryza is so annoying to deal with for other decks, and can just completely invalidate certain decks' win cons. So it does belong in tier 1 in my opinion. And I don't know what else really would go in tier 1, honestly, here. I think there are some other decent decks in the format. I think Six Sam's maybe tier 1. I mean, this got second place in the last event we held for the format. And also, this is topped consistently throughout the DM era, or not DM, but GX era, since it's been released. So maybe this thing is set up to counter Monarchs. I don't know. Or maybe Baboon Burn is. I don't know. Baboon Burn didn't really see any results at the last event. I mean, it did top, but, like, it's kind of tough. I mean, one person played it, one person topped. So, like, maybe I don't know. I'm going to put Baboon Burn in tier 1. I think Burn could be tier 1, so I'm just going to put it there. It needs further testing, I think. Going on to tier 2, though, Zombie, the namesake deck of the format, I think is tier 2. It is very powerful if it manages to pop off, and it did top in the past event. However, as someone who's played the deck a fair bit myself, I've noticed it has many flaws. It can brick in awkward points, and also, if your opponent summons out a Ryza and spins back the card save return, that's really bad for you. So it can be a bit tricky to navigate. So I think it is tier 2 for now. It could get better in the future. But you also got to contend with the fact that another really good deck in the format is Macro Cosmos, whether it be Macro Monarch or just Macro in general, like anti-meta Macro or something. Decks that play things that banish things before they hit the grave are very good against variety decks in the format. It's good against Perfect Circle Monarch because you lose access to like your Disc Commander and things like that, your Treeborn Frog, etc. It's very good against zombies because they lose their entire point of being a deck, right? Their entire point of being a deck is to bring things back from the graveyard, and if nothing hits the graveyard, then you're in for a bad time. So I think that is probably better than zombies here because it does actually hit other decks in the format. So I will put it in the top of tier 2. Maybe even this should go in tier 1 over Baboon Burn. I think maybe, yeah, I'll do that. Because I do think that this deck is pretty good. Baboon is just a bit too untested. It did top here. It could potentially have potential for the future, but I do think macro decks also hurt Baboon Burn a lot because you're losing, you're sending things to grave, right? And that is needed for Baboon to trigger. So, yeah, I think macro probably belongs in tier 1 over the Baboon Burn deck. Demise of Decay doesn't really see much experimentation here. Could be Rogue. I don't know. I'm just including it because, again, I think it's something that maybe should be explored more. But it is a bit worse in this format, in my opinion, given the amount of spin that Ryza has. And, like, it's just, like, kind of awkward to go for in this format. And also, like, the Doom Dozer part of the deck is shut off by Macrocosmos and stuff. So I don't really think that Demise is the best here, but it is Rogue over Trash, I think. In terms of Trash, I think the deck that I'm going to place in Trash is Venom. This is mainly because I covered it on the channel because it was a new archetype released in Tactical Evolution. Really bad deck. Just awful, awful stuff. Should never really be touched again. A deck I forgot to mention in Trooper format actually is Big City. This is a very, very cool hero deck. I do think it's probably tier 2. I think it's pretty neat, and like I like it. I think it's probably tier 2 in Trooper as well. And yeah, I hope more people experiment with it. I'll probably be doing another video on it for Perfect Circle format because I'm not sure if this deck really got much in Perfect Circle, but it is an iconic deck from that time period, so I figured I'd mention it there. But yeah, I like the deck a lot, so I'm going to put it in tier 2. And next up we got Gadgets. I will also put this one in tier 2 because I think Gadgets are just a very flexible deck in general in this format. It did lose Smashing Grounds and Fissures, but like, you know, generally if you've got the 1-for-1 removal in the back row, that's pretty fine. You also have all the Gadgets semi-limited, so that is a bit of a knock against this deck, but I do think it is still pretty fine. Some of these tier 2 decks probably drop down to Rogue in the future. Some of the tier 1 decks even might drop down in the future because I do think the Perfect Circle Monarch is just the best deck in the format, and so maybe it's tier 0 around that. I don't quite know. But what I do know is that I'll have more thoughts on how things shake out in Perfect Circle format when I'm done covering that. If you want to stay up to date and covered to that, subscribe to the channel, and also, you know, stay tuned for future videos like this one. I'm probably going to save the tier list videos for the end of the year or the beginning of the year, depending on when you watch it. And I feel it's a nice sort of thing to just recap the whole year leading up to this point and look forward to the future. So I hope that you did enjoy it. Hopefully it was helpful to you if you're planning on trying out any of these formats for yourself. And next year's going to be even longer potentially. So I don't know, maybe I'll break them up further in the future, but like I kind of like just having a big thing at the end of the year. But let me know what you thought about this video and any thoughts you have on the formats that I covered or just the tier list in general, whether you agree, disagree, what your thoughts are in general. I love talking with y'all as always. And as always, big shout out to my patrons, Rinspin, Porkchip, Brent Knocker, Tyler Compton, GeoMyFest, Dumptruck, and Scout Zero. It means a lot that you all support me and encourage me to make more videos like this one in the future. I hope you all enjoyed as always. Until next time, I've been Ben from YGO from Zero. I'm signing off.